If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 41 Hogwarts Express 3. In the presence of Asterian's aura, Rose remained perfectly calm, curiously observing the boy's shadow, while the imposing hundred-eyed hound captured all her attention. It was a special grade cursed spirit, but she couldn't understand why the cursed spirit obeyed Asterian's commands. Could it be his innate technique? She thought, looking at Asterian with growing curiosity in her intense blue eyes. It seemed that this cousin was truly intriguing. As a special grade witch, Rose was fine, but the situation was entirely different for Ron and Hermione. Their faces paled, and their eyes widened with horror and fear. A sadistic and chilling laughter echoed in their minds, almost causing their hearts to stop beating. Suddenly, everything ceased, as if nothing had happened, except for the sweat covering their bodies. What was that? Gasping, Hermione asked, looking at Asterian with a terrified gaze. She had seen cursed spirits before, but this was an entirely different level. It was as if she were facing a cold, emotionless monster. Ignoring the frightened girl, Asterian directed his gaze at Ron and spoke coldly, "If your father were here, he would probably be humbly kneeling, asking for permission to speak, let alone you, his son, so behave yourself or I will make you behave." Ron's cheeks flushed, almost as if they were burning, but he remained silent, still haunted by the feeling of suffocation and fear that had overwhelmed him moments ago. It was the scariest thing he had ever experienced in his life. "Did you have to scare Hermione?" Rose, who had suddenly appeared beside the girl, spoke while gently comforting her, still disturbed by the events that had just unfolded. Asterian rolled his eyes at Rose and turned to Hermione, apologizing gracefully as he placed his hand over his chest. "I apologize, Miss Granger, it wasn't my intention to scare you. Sometimes I can be a bit reckless." Asterian didn't lie. Despite being more mature than most of his age, he was still just a 13-year-old boy after all. He wasn't perfect, Asterian acknowledged his flaws. Like any extremely powerful teenager, he was impulsive, arrogant, sarcastic, and often quite cruel and sadistic. He knew his flaws, but at the same time, he didn't want to change, at least not at the moment. Upon hearing his apology, Hermione was surprised for a moment. She nodded as she looked at him and moved closer to Rose, cautious of the most handsome yet extremely frightening boy she had ever seen. As for Ron, he seemed to be ignored by everyone in the cabin. It was as if he were invisible. This forced the young man to leave to avoid embarrassment, but as he was about to exit, the cabin door was opened once again, this time by a handsome teenager with platinum blonde hair and an arrogant look on his face, followed by two large and almost identical teenagers. Although the young man's smile lasted only a second after seeing Asterian inside the cabin. Lord Asterian Black, Draco forced a smile on his face and greeted him, though anyone could see the discomfort on his face. Heir Malfoy, Asterian also greeted him with a cold look. If there was one person he disliked and even harbored hatred towards, it was the teenager in front of him. Draco Malfoy was someone he had despised and wanted to kill for a long time. He was only alive because of Narcissa. If it weren't for her, he would have reduced the entire Malfoy manor to ashes. The pain he caused Narcissa was enough for Asterian to want to gut him like an animal, along with his father and the entire Malfoy house. "So, came to kiss my shoes like your father or something else, Heir Malfoy?" Seeing Draco standing there, Asterian continued to speak, his voice dripping with sarcasm and irony. Asterian was humiliating him on purpose. To Lucius Malfoy, it didn't matter if it was Asterian or Voldemort, the man would kneel and kiss his shoes without batting an eyelid if it brought power and wealth to the Malfoy house. Draco clenched his fists and tightened his jaw. His blue eyes inherited from Narcissa practically burned with anger. "I heard rumors that Rose Potter was on the Express and wanted to meet her," Draco said, suppressing the growing fury in his chest. He calmed down and responded with a polite smile on his face. Asterian simply pointed to Rose and Hermione, who watched the scene with curious eyes. Draco followed his direction and saw two teenagers, one with white hair and the other with brown hair. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Lady Potter. My name is Draco Malfoy, son of Lucius Malfoy." Draco focused his attention on the white-haired teenager, greeting her with the most charming smile he possessed. He continued speaking with gentle and flowery words. "I am a big fan of your feats as a baby." Rose only looked at him with interest, but precisely she was curious to know the relationship between Draco and Asterian. They seemed like enemies, but in her eyes, Draco was too weak for such a feat, so their animosity must have come from somewhere else. "The courage of fools," Aeran scoffed, looking at Draco showing off like a peacock. Was that it? Did Lucius really send Draco to seduce Rose? The thought made him laugh, but the joke was really bad, even tasteless. Aren't you going to greet my friend? Rose, who began to feel bored again, asked, pointing to Hermione beside her. Draco looked at her and scanned her from head to toe. He didn't recognize the girl, he didn't remember her attending any parties. Hermione Granger, although uncomfortable with his scrutinizing gaze, Hermione introduced herself. Knowing that there was no Granger house in Britain, that only meant one thing, and it made the beautiful smile on Draco's face stiffen. He looked at the girl with a look of disgust. Mudblood. Hermione remained indifferent to the racist comments, it wasn't the first time she had been called that. In Diagon Alley, she was called that by some arrogant boys and girls. She learned not long after what the word meant, but in the end, it didn't matter. As her mother had told her, she ignored the words of others and moved forward with her head held high, like a noble queen looking at her subjects. Rose, although she didn't know what it meant, was not foolish, and she could see that it was an offensive term. The sense of amusement she had for Draco turned into deep disgust in a mere instant. What she hated most in life was bullying. I think it's time for you to leave, Mr. Malfoy. Rose looked at Draco and spoke slowly with a slight coercion emanating from her. Lady Potter, you'll learn that some people are better than others, Draco tried to argue, feeling the pressure on him increasing with each passing second. I have eyes to identify trash, you don't need to worry about that, Rose sarcastically replied as she increased the pressure even more. She was kinder than Aeran, if it were him, he would have made the boy kneel until he passed out. Draco, feeling he couldn't bear the growing pressure anymore, gave one last resentful glance at Aeran and hurriedly left the cabin with his henchmen, leaving Rose, Hermione, and Aeran behind. Well, that was certainly a scene straight out of a children's book, Aeran commented sarcastically. Rose rolled her eyes at his words, noticing that Aeran was particularly sarcastic, but not in an annoying way, in a fun and ironic way, as he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. Do you know something interesting, Lady Potter? Aeran looked at Rose and spoke mysteriously. First of all, drop the lady, just call me Rose, I'm not an old noble lady. Before Aeran could continue, Rose interjected with an impatient expression. Ignoring her request, Aeran spoke with a growing amusement in his eyes. Lady Potter, did you know that the blonde who just left is the son of Narcissa Black? Although dissatisfied with still being called lady, Rose couldn't help but curse how incestuous her ancestors were. Couldn't they just find other families further away? Chapter 42, Capitulo 40, Expresso to Hogwarts, 4. Under Aeran's pragmatic and cold gaze, Rose pursed her lips, feeling like a lab rat under those eyes. Any problem, vampire? Rose asked, lazily leaning back. With an especially irritating smile, she crossed her legs and stared at him. Vampire? Aeran asked, confused. From head to toe, you literally look like a vampire, so handsome it's almost inhuman, Rose pointed out, still smiling. Would that make you a snowflake or a snowman? Prefer an ice cube or ice cream? Aeran sarcastically replied. He had no intention of falling behind in the word game. Rose's smile tightened, realizing she had met a worthy opponent. However, she would not back down without a fight. For a bloodsucker, you sure have a poisonous tongue, she retorted, her blue eyes sparkling with amusement. But the next scene momentarily made Rose and Hermione lose their composure. They saw Aeran's hand suddenly bleeding, but what shocked them the most was seeing him stretch out his tongue and slowly lick the crimson blood from his pale skin. An enveloping aura emanated from him, making it difficult for the two girls to look away. Hermione swallowed hard and reluctantly averted her gaze, the scene was too intense for her 13-year-old mind. Her imagination began to conjure up countless inappropriate scenarios for her age. Has anyone ever told you that you're a SE*Y bastard? Rose coughed to cover her own expression, looking at her cousin with a hungry look. Many times. Women tend to get quite excited around me, Aeran replied casually, finishing licking the blood from his hand. His lips were now stained crimson, resembling a forbidden fruit trying to entice people to taste its sweet nectar. Rose and Hermione both cursed and mentally thanked the woman who brought Aeran into the world. He was literally the embodiment of sin, tempting them to sin as much as possible. What was most irritating was that Aeran was aware of his own appearance and used it as a deadly weapon, especially against them, young maidens who had never tasted the flavor of love. Do you already know which house you'll be placed in at Hogwarts? Perhaps realizing that Aeran was not like the other young people she had met before, Hermione asked, her brown eyes shining with a spark of wisdom and curiosity, basic qualities of a book lover, something that Aeran also shared. Slytherin. If I end up in another, it's possible that Arcturus will come to Hogwarts and burn that filthy hat, Aeran replied. Although the idea of letting Arcturus freak out if he ended up in Gryffindor was tempting, he still wanted to be in Slytherin, mainly because of the man's heritage in that magical castle. Filthy hat. Rose and Hermione looked at him, confused. Hogwarts has 4 houses. You will be sorted into one of them based on your personality and morality. This test is done by a very old and dirty magical hat, Aeran revealed the secret without much concern. It wasn't a big deal in his eyes. Rose and Hermione exchanged surprised looks. Hogwarts was truly magical. At the same time, they longed for the school even more. Observing Rose devouring the freshly bought sweets without caring about her image, Aeran covered his face with his palm to avoid seeing the scene. Are you sure you don't want to try these chocolate delights? I don't understand how someone could not like the supreme food of the gods, Rose said, swallowing a chocolate frog and squinting with pleasure as she felt the sweetness overflow on her tongue. You shouldn't eat too much chocolate, Rose. It's bad for your teeth. My parents are dentists and recommend staying away from chocolate, Hermione intervened, adopting a tone of reproach for the sake of her new friend's health. Don't be such a killjoy, my own. Enjoy the sweet taste of sugar. Rose ignored Hermione and popped a piece of chocolate into her new best friend's mouth, disregarding her protest. I'll pass. Not a fan of chocolate, Aeran recoiled, dodging a chocolate crumb. His words made Rose widen her eyes, looking at Aeran as if he had committed an unforgivable crime, a heretic, a lost lamb of God. She approached him with quick steps and stared at him inches away. Their eyes met intensely. How can you not like sweets? They're cute and lovely, every bite is like biting into divine perfection. She spoke with her face dangerously close to his. I said I don't like chocolate, not sweet things. Pushing her face away with his hand, Aeran spoke slightly uncomfortable, he really didn't like close contact with strangers. Perhaps sensing his discomfort and knowing this was her chance to get back at him for the SE*Y scene he made her witness earlier, Rose flashed a mischievous grin and sat next to him, putting her arm around his neck, pulling him closer. Tell me, why does the cute little puppy in your shadow obey you? She asked, whispering sensually into his ear. Aeran displayed a rather helpless expression on his face, he wanted to punch the delicate and pretty girl for her audacity to touch him, but stopped, realizing he couldn't harm her due to Limitless, even though they were in such close proximity. He could feel Limitless acting like a second skin, protecting Rose in all directions. Creation and manipulation of cursed spirits. I won't explain because the name is self-explanatory, Aeran pushed her arm away from his neck and moved back, looking cautiously at Rose. He had already placed Rose in the weird category, the same category as Bellatrix. By the way, adorable Baskerville? Are you blind or something? He was created to be as frightening as possible, the words adorable and Baskerville don't mix under any circumstances. In a world like ours, you seem like a Pokémon master, catching all sorts of Pokémon, Rose spoke with genuine admiration in her voice. Then, as if struck by an idea, she looked at him with an extremely excited expression. Tell me, can you create a Pikachu, can't you? She asked, gripping his shoulders, her blue eyes seeming to burn with a flame of hope. Is that it? You've really reduced one of the most powerful innate techniques on the planet to a mere Pokémon master. Aeran was stunned. There were so many things to create, and she chose a Pokémon? Besides, has Pokémon really been released earlier in this world? You seem like a culturally ignorant man, Starlight. Let me guide you through the world of Japanese anime. Rose put her arm around his neck again and said with a cheerful and contagious smile. Starlight. Aeran just let out a resigned sigh and didn't say anything about the nickname. He felt that even if he contested, she would ignore him. Besides, he realized that his reputation could be ruined sooner or later if he got too close to her. Don't be so petty, it's just a Pokémon. You probably can create thousands with a snap of your fingers. You're literally the Pokémon god. Rose continued to insist, wishing for a Pikachu in particular. But Aeran remained indifferent to her requests. Seeing that she wouldn't be able to change his mind no matter how hard she tried, Rose showed a mischievous look and subtly threatened him. Believe it or not, it's better for me to receive a Pikachu, or we'll be training a lot. Asterion just scoffed at her threat. Training? If we were to do that, I'd be rubbing your face in the ground. Just you? No offense, but you're weak. Rose laughed and spoke, with a particularly irritating tone. You seem confident for someone addicted to sweets. Asterion spoke indifferently, starting to emit his magical energy lightly. I'd say it's you who's confident, bloodsucker. Rose challenged, maintaining her provocative tone. Her magical energy clashed with his, creating small gusts of wind inside the cabin. Seeing that things were spiraling towards an inevitable fight, Hermione quickly intervened. We're on a train, don't forget that. Tisk. Rose clicked her tongue and reined in her magical energy. Hup. Asterion just huffed and also reined in his magical energy. Seeing the two calming down, Hermione sighed in relief and rubbed her forehead, feeling a massive headache coming on. Chapter 43, Capitulo 41, Expresso to Hogwarts, 5. Asterion and Rose, who had calmed down, were now engaged in separate activities. Asterion was absorbed in his reading, accompanied by a glass of wine beside him, ignoring the reproachful glances he received from both girls. Meanwhile, Rose and Hermione were deepening their friendship without any barriers, as if they had been friends for a long time, despite having only known each other for a few hours. Rose, about my innate technique. Before Hermione could finish her sentence, Asterion interrupted her. Miss Granger, I must warn you that discussing your innate technique is a rather intimate matter. I'm not saying not to share it with the snowflake, but avoid discussing it in the presence of others, like me, he said, looking seriously into her eyes. Is something wrong? Hermione was taken aback. The innate technique is a rare treasure for wizards. It is the foundation of a noble lineage. Having an innate technique means that your descendants can inherit this ability, solidifying the status of a noble house, Asterion patiently explained. Not everyone possesses an innate technique. Having an innate technique implies having a much higher potential than those who have only awakened their magical energy. Hiding your innate technique can bring benefits in the future, especially against your enemies, as they would not know what your trump cards are. For example, the Potter family is famous for the 6 eyes and the limitless. One could say that in every noble house, there is a book explaining all the strengths and weaknesses of the Potter family's innate technique. The Black family is the same, practically everyone knows the strengths and weaknesses. Hermione nodded and looked gratefully at Asterion, while at the same time, she clenched her fists happily, knowing she had more potential than most. She had always been the best in school and intended to continue that way at Hogwarts. Listening to his explanation, Rose scoffed. It doesn't matter if they know or not, in the face of true strength, strategies, conspiracies, and lies are nothing but paper tigers. Asterion rolled his eyes at the girl's arrogant words. If he thought he was arrogant, Rose was even more so than him. Which was no small feat. Asterion was really arrogant, but not on Rose's level. Rose looked at Asterion leaning against the seat by the window and asked curiously, Star, you're really a noble, right? I am, Asterion replied, looking at her with a puzzled expression at the question. Is it like in the books? I mean the noble society, full of conspiracies, murders, and political intrigues. It's similar, but reality often surpasses fiction, Asterion responded, with a cold look. There are indeed political intrigues, alliances, and rivalries among noble families. But most of the time, the real battles are fought behind the scenes between factions, away from the public eye. It's a complex game where cunning and power are the main currencies. Rose seemed intrigued by Asterion's response. She tilted her head, absorbing the information. Then, have you been involved in any of these games? She asked, with a curious sparkle in her eyes. More than I'd like, Asterion replied, still maintaining an indifferent expression. Asterion explained the factions clearly, revealing not only the structure of the British Wizarding Society, but also the complexities of power relations between them. Rose listened attentively, absorbing every word with evident interest. So, the Sacred 28 are the oldest and most influential noble houses, Rose summarized, processing the information. And the Light faction is led by Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard in the world. That's right, confirmed Asterion, watching her reaction closely. He could see the intelligence and cunning in Rose's eyes, characteristics he considered crucial in a plan. He hoped to disrupt Albus Dumbledore's plans somewhat. It was obvious that the man wanted Rose to take his place as leader of the Light faction, something that was not in Asterion's interest. A weak light faction was essential for him to seize power without much difficulty. And the neutral faction, led by the green grass family, is sort of a balance between the other two. Rose inquired, connecting the dots. Exactly, Asterion nodded, impressed by how quickly she grasped it. The green grass family acts as a mediator and maintains a certain balance of power between the factions. Hermione, who listened to the conversation with interest, seemed fascinated by the details revealed by Asterion. She absorbed every piece of information eagerly, her intellect eager to understand the nuances of this hidden and shadowy world of politics. But the balance has long been broken, Asterion spoke, causing the two young women to look at him curiously, eagerly awaiting his words. I have officially become a special grade wizard, shattering the fragile balance of power, especially with my engagement to the heiress of the green grass family. One could say we control almost this entire country. Rose could understand what Asterion was saying. She was a special grade wizard according to Hagrid and could grasp the weight of what that meant. She could literally destroy entire cities with just one red. And her cousin was one too. But Hermione didn't know. To her, the personal power of an individual being able to influence an entire nation was somewhat unreal. But it wasn't her fault. She could never have imagined she was standing next to people capable of destroying entire cities. So, your marriage to Daphne further strengthens your position in wizarding society, Hermione commented, with a gleam of understanding in her brown eyes. Yes, it's part of a larger strategy to consolidate our power and influence, confirmed Asterion, without revealing all the details of his plans. Rose, on the other hand, was more interested in the personal dynamics between Asterion and his fiancée. Do you really like her? She asked, curious to know more about the love life of her distant cousin. Asterion pondered for a moment before responding. Like is a complicated word, but I respect Daphne and recognize the importance of our alliance. As the conversation continued, Rose and Hermione began to grasp better the complexities of the world they were about to enter. The train continued on its course toward Hogwarts, and with it, the lives of these young wizards were about to intertwine in adventures and challenges that would shape their destinies in unpredictable ways. Chapter 44, Chapter 42, Hogwarts, 1. Lower your heads, children. Asterion, Rose, and Hermione lowered their heads at Hagrid's shout and raised them again after crossing the bridge. Beautiful. A collective sigh echoed over the moonlit lake. There was no other word to describe what these young wizards and witches were feeling at this moment, seeing Hogwarts for the first time. The castle atop the hill seemed to possess a strange allure and mystery that made you unable to look away from it. It felt like ancient magic resonating with the very essence of all magic, like a primal, ancient heartbeat. The castle seems alive, Rose murmured, gazing at the castle. If it isn't, it's not far off, Asterion heard her murmur and nodded, looking at the castle. Should I be able to create a living castle? He wondered. He thought that if he could, he would be the first to do something like that, even his ancestors hadn't thought of it. We're arriving, mind your step when getting off, children, Hagrid, alone in a boat, shouted again. The boat beneath him seemed like it would sink at any moment with his enormous weight. But in the end, upon reaching the dock, the small boat survived another day. Stepping off the boat and onto the wooden bridge, Asterion quickly distanced himself from the boat, more precisely, from the fourth occupant who was on the boat, a girl with beautiful pale blonde hair and dreamy silver eyes. She had 2 carats as earrings in her delicate ears. Asterion recognized the girl, there was no way not to. But recognizing her and wanting to approach her were 2 different things. He had already exceeded his quota of crazy women in his life, one Bellatrix was enough. But the girl didn't think the same way. Can I pet him? She asked, approaching Asterion, who continued to step back, her dreamy eyes wandering in the shadow of the black air. No, he particularly dislikes people wanting to pet him, Asterion denied without any hesitation. We'll never know unless I touch him, the girl insisted, staring directly into Asterion's eyes, as if she were looking straight into his soul. Looking into those eyes, Asterion couldn't help but notice the familiarity they shared with Gellert Grindelwald's eyes, the Dark Lord. Rose and Hermione laughed, watching Asterion constantly backing away, but every time he moved back, she moved closer, creating a rather amusing scene where a boy retreated and a girl approached. For them, it was truly amusing to see the cold and indifferent Asterion Black, a special grade wizard, fleeing from a seemingly harmless girl. While Asterion kept backing away from the girl, Hagrid, in front of the crowd of new students, banged heavily on the gigantic wooden doors, creating a loud sound. It didn't take long for the doors to open, revealing a middle-aged woman with stern features. Her hair, almost entirely white, was arranged in an elegant bun, and she wore emerald robes and glasses on her eyes. "Professor McGonagall, I've brought the new students," Hagrid said, his voice naturally loud. "Thank you for your hard work, Hagrid. I'll take care of the children now," she replied, looking at the nearly 300 teenagers, who fell silent with a simple glance from her. Hagrid nodded and left with heavy steps, but not before waving to Rose at the back of the crowd, who also waved back gently to him. "Follow me in silence," Professor McGonagall said, fully opening the massive wooden doors. Soon, almost 300 boys and girls followed quietly into the castle. "I have to say, I'm curious how Hagrid's parents met," Aeran, who had managed to shake off the girl with dreamy eyes, murmured to himself, after watching the giant human hybrid disappear with a lantern in hand. To give you some context, a giant typically stands between 4 to 6 meters tall. The tallest recorded human reached a maximum height of 2.72 meters, 8 feet 11.1 in, and weighed 199 kilograms, 439 pounds. Still, faced with a giant, they seemed like a child barely reaching the waist, so the idea of a giant and a human mating and conceiving was something that left Aeran very confused. Rose rolled her eyes upon hearing the murmuring of her new friend, or at least, she thought they were friends. One thing she noticed about Aeran was that the boy was particularly curious about everything. But not on a normal level, anything he found interesting. He had a rather unsettling gaze, almost like a mad scientist looking at his subject. She resolved to keep an eye on Aeran to prevent him from dissecting some students out of curiosity. In front of all the new students, Professor McGonagall began to explain the basics to them. "Hogwarts has 4 houses: Gryffindor, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff. You will be sorted into one of them after a test at the sorting ceremony." She continued to explain until they reached another pair of massive doors. "Before entering," she said to the new students, "before you enter, straighten your clothes and correct any inadequacies in your attire." In the midst of the crowd, a girl with black hair adjusted her skirt when suddenly, she felt someone tap her right shoulder. "I'm busy, Gwen. I wasn't talking to you, Melina." The girl looked confusedly at her friend who was on her left and then glanced to her right. She saw a transparent face smiling eerily at her. "Ha!" She let out a terrifying scream that startled everyone around. But it was just the beginning of pandemonium, as more and more ghosts emerged through the walls, frightening the new students. What followed was a symphony of screams of horror and fear. Aeran remained indifferent to all the commotion. Cursed spirits were far more terrifying than these ghosts, so he wasn't afraid. On the contrary, he discreetly looked with greed at the hundreds of ghosts flying above the students. Due to Hogwarts, ghosts might seem common, but they're not at all common in nature. The requirements for a soul to transform into a ghost after death were at the very least challenging. Firstly, you have to die in a location with a high concentration of magical energy, preferably on top of ley lines, which is not easy to find. Hogwarts, for example, was built on top of one of the most important ley lines in the world. Secondly, you have to have an intact soul. Thirdly, you have to die with great remorse. And finally, you have to die with the body relatively intact. Discreetly, Aeran made a hand seal, connecting his thumb to his index finger, forming a circle. In the next moment, one of the hundreds of ghosts flew discreetly to Aeran, who simply opened the pocket of his pants and the ghost was sucked inside. Looking around, he found Rose's incredibly blue eyes staring at him with an amused look and a mischievous smile on her lips. Aeran remained indifferent upon realizing he'd been caught and continued to look straight ahead as if nothing had happened. Author's thoughts: Hogwarts at last. In the next chapters I will be skipping some unnecessary parts, which everyone has already read a million times. Chapter 45, Chapter 43, Hogwarts, 2. Seeing that all the students had calmed down after the ghosts left, McGonagall nodded satisfactorily and finally opened the doors. Aeran noticed that the dining hall was much larger than depicted in the movies, which was perfectly normal. The number of students in Hogwarts reached into the thousands. Looking up, he saw the famous starry sky above the dining hall. He appreciated the beauty of the stars for a moment and then refocused on his surroundings. All the older students were seated at 8 tables, 2 for each house. Slytherin had the smallest number of members, while Gryffindor and Hufflepuff vied for the house with the most members. The Gryffindor members were the loudest, followed by Hufflepuff. The Ravenclaw members were quieter and more discreet, whispering instead of talking aloud. The Slytherin members were in complete silence. Aeran almost instantly felt the gaze of most members fall upon him. The ones who didn't look were probably those with Muggle-born or mixed-blood descent, who ended up in Slytherin. Looking over to the teacher's table, Asterian's gaze fell upon the current most powerful wizard in the world, Albus Dumbledore. And Asterian had to admit, the man was unparalleled in power, even more so than Gellert Grindelwald. Albus Dumbledore possessed the most devastating innate technique in the world, capable, according to rumors, of annihilating the world itself. Looking at him, Asterian confirmed that these rumors were true. Rumors said that the man's innate technique was related to the sun, and Asterian believed it. The tiny amount of magical energy emanating from Dumbledore carried an unimaginable scorching heat. As if sensing Asterian's gaze, Dumbledore turned his eyes to him with a gentle and warm smile. If it weren't for the immense magical energy of the man, Asterian might have mistaken him for a simple innocent old man. "What do you think, Lady Potter?" Asterian murmured to Rose, beside him. Rose rolled her eyes at the way he addressed her. He called her a Lady Potter on purpose to annoy her, but she still responded sincerely. "Strong, about 1.5 times the magical energy I currently possess. If I want to surpass him, it should take me about 2 to 3 years. But if we were to fight using only innate techniques, I should win now, since his technique is entirely focused on destruction." "Just to clarify, you just said you would defeat the current strongest man in the world," Asterian commented, still incredulous at Rose's arrogance. Let's not mention the vast difference in combat experience between Rose and Dumbledore, just the number of spells the man could cast was headache-inducing for any special-grade wizard. With an irritating smile, Rose looked at Asterian with an arrogant air and declared, "It's not arrogance, it's pure reality. Besides, he won't hold the title of strongest man in the world for long, that title will be mine." From that moment on, Asterian didn't consider himself arrogant. Rose possessed that characteristic more than he did. Beside a chair in front of the teacher's table, Professor McGonagall picked up a scroll and announced the first name on the list. "Abbott, Hannah." A visibly nervous girl emerged from the crowd of freshmen and took her seat in the chair, facing all the students directly. Professor McGonagall picked up the sorting hat and placed it on Hannah's head. 30 seconds later, the hat shouted loudly, "Hufflepuff!" The Hufflepuff table erupted into applause. McGonagall transfigured the girls' robes to match the chosen house theme. Hannah stepped down from the chair with a smile and quickly made her way to the Hufflepuff table. Professor McGonagall continued calling out one student after another until it was Asterian's turn, which didn't take long as he was at the top of the list. "Black, Asterian." The hall almost instantly fell silent. In England, Asterian's fame was almost as great as Rose's, especially with the help of Rita Skeeter. The peak of Asterian's fame came after his birthday party, when Rita wrote an article about the relationship between Asterian and the fearsome Dark Lord, Gellert Grindelwald. One could say that no one would be surprised if Asterian declared himself a Dark Lord. "Asterian doesn't seem so scary, he's very polite and courteous. I don't see why everyone is afraid of him," Hermione said beside Rose, noticing the fear in many people. But how could she know the terror people lived through 13 years ago, where everyone lived under constant fear of being killed at any moment? Rose just smiled and didn't care about the tense atmosphere in the hall. Her attention was entirely on Asterian. Now she could understand why he was so cold and indifferent. Ignoring the stares falling upon him, Asterian walked, and everyone made way without saying a word. Before taking his seat, Asterian directed his gaze to the teacher's table, focusing on the man in the purple turban beside Severus Snape. Even before arriving at Hogwarts, Asterian had decided to deviate from the original story. After all, only a fool would stay under the same roof as a lunatic like Voldemort, who wouldn't hesitate to destroy Hogwarts to achieve his plans. So, Quirinus Quirrell needed to die. Asterian was undecided about how and where. Maybe he would even call Rose to join in the fun. After all, both of his parents had perished at the hands of Voldemort. But initially, Asterian didn't expect Voldemort to actually appear as in the original plot. After all, Rose was a special grade witch. Even at his peak, Voldemort wouldn't stand a chance against her, especially now that he was just a fragment of a soul. However, to his surprise, he could feel an absurd amount of resentment emanating from Quirinus. There was no doubt that the former Dark Lord who once terrorized all of Britain had been reduced to a mere parasite. Asterian was simply perplexed by how Voldemort expected to defeat Rose. "Is there a problem, Mr. Black?" Professor McGonagall looked confused by his sudden pause. "It's nothing, Professor, just pondering something interesting," Asterian replied indifferently. With that said, he took his seat and crossed his legs, one over the other, looking out across the entire dining hall as a king would gaze upon his subjects. Author's thoughts, as I said before, apart from some events and classes that take place in the first year, don't expect everything to happen the same way. I've already planned it and everything is ready, I just need to write. Chapter 46, Chapter 44, Hogwarts, 3. Feeling the hat being placed on his head, Asterion soon heard a curious voice. "Hello, my young lord, may you ask your cursed spirit to allow me to check your character?" As Asterion had mentioned earlier, Baskerville was created to protect him from everything, including mind rapists like Snape and Dumbledore, who were masters of occlumency and legilimency. Asterion spoke with Baskerville, and the hat managed to perform its job clearly. It spoke with a voice full of wisdom and curiosity. "How interesting. Helga would embrace you with her unwavering loyalty to your family. Rowena would open her private library to you with her insatiable thirst for knowledge. Godric would teach you his precious swordsmanship with his bravery. Salazar might invite you to dissect some interesting snake he found. I must say, you are the most challenging person I've had in my 1,000 years of existence, my young lord. Even Merlin wasn't as difficult, the man had a heart of gold with his love for muggles despite being from Slytherin. But I really didn't expect a direct descendant of one of my creators to marry a black. I must say, it's an unexpectedly fitting combination." The Sorting Hat continued to speak without pause as Asterion listened with curiosity. To his surprise, the hat was analyzing its own soul. The process of such an act was so meticulous and precise that it left him speechless with the genius behind its creation. "Do you wish to be in any specific house, my young lord?" The Sorting Hat asked, giving Asterion the option to choose for himself. "Slytherin, please. If I end up in Gryffindor, my great-grandfather might want to set you on fire. He was already fed up with you putting Sirius in Gryffindor," Asterion mentally spoke to the Sorting Hat. "Sirius Black, I remember the young lad, he broke the 1,000-year tradition of the Black family. Before him, all members of the Black family went to Slytherin," the Sorting Hat spoke with a voice full of amusement, showing no fear of Asterion's words. He continued, "Before I announce your house, by the order of all 4 of my creators, I have an obligation to say something, my young lord. If you wish to awaken your second inborn technique, seek out the Chamber of Secrets. Salazar Slytherin's heritage resides in the Chamber of Secrets, along with the method to awaken your second inborn technique currently dormant." Before Asterion could even speak, the Sorting Hat spoke for the entire hall to hear. "Slytherin." Everyone at the Slytherin table stood up and applauded, a shower of applause in respect for their future leader. Asterion descended from the chair, and his robes gained a green hue along with the crest of Slytherin House. Casting a slightly arrogant glance at Rose and Hermione, he walked over to the Slytherin table and took a seat in an empty spot. Nobody came to speak to him at the moment because it wasn't an appropriate time. The sorting ceremony continued, and some new students were sorted into Slytherin, such as Draco and his cronies, whose names Asterion didn't bother to remember. The notable students sorted into Slytherin included Amelia Bulstrode, Tracy Davis, Theodore Knott, Pansy Parkinson, and Blaise Zabinai. In addition, obviously, his fiancée, Daphne Greengrass. It wasn't the first time Asterion had met Daphne. The Greengrass heiress had often visited Black Manor over the past 3 years to get to know each other and deepen their relationship. Asterion had also visited Greengrass Manor to meet his future in-laws and sister-in-law, Astoria. It could be said that they knew each other well. They had learned a lot about each other over these 3 years. For Daphne, Asterion respected her, as she had renounced many things for her family. Perhaps that's why their relationship was good, even though there was no love at the moment, but they both respected each other, which Asterion greatly appreciated. The first time they met, Asterion was surprised to recognize her as the same girl who had danced at the birthday party. What he had expected to be just a passing encounter in his life turned into the first of many, and perhaps for his whole life, until the end of his days. Daphne, under the accusatory and envious glares of the Slytherin girls, especially from Pansy Parkinson, elegantly sat down beside Asterion. "I sensed your magical energy on the train, is everything all right?" Daphne asked discreetly, her shoulders touching Asterion's. Beside Daphne sat a girl with brown hair and chocolate-colored skin, Tracy Davis, Daphne's close friend, someone Asterion had met when visiting Greengrass Manor. "It's nothing, just a particularly irritating red-headed nuisance," Asterion replied, looking at his fiancée with a slightly gentler gaze. She noticed his look and offered a small smile, her lips stained with red lipstick. "Weasleys tend to be irritating at Hogwarts from what I've heard," Daphne murmured to him. Before she could continue, applause rang out throughout the great hall, so loud it seemed to make the place tremble. All of Slytherin table looked up and noticed a girl with white hair walking amidst the thunderous applause of everyone. Rose Potter! Rose Potter! Rose Potter! Daphne looked at the legendary Rose Potter with a curious gaze. After all, she was the girl who lived, the one who held the record for defeating a Dark Lord when she was just a baby. Is she powerful? Daphne asked Asterion. Yes, in a fight to the death, I can kill her at the cost of dying myself, Asterion replied indifferently, watching Rose sitting in the chair. I didn't expect her to be a special grade witch. Daphne narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. Dumbledore certainly hid her very well from the magical world. You're wrong, Rose Potter wasn't raised in the wizarding world, I dare say she was raised with her muggle relatives, Asterion whispered to her. This made Daphne widen her eyes, she couldn't believe that the savior of the British magical world was raised by muggles. But then she realized something. Her blue eyes fell upon the old man sitting in the head chair. Dumbledore did this intentionally to prevent Rose Potter from siding with the purebloods, knowing the pain of Muggleborns, Rose would fight for the rights of the most disadvantaged class. I didn't expect Dumbledore to think decades ahead. Daphne sighed in wonder at Dumbledore's foresight. That old man may seem innocent, but he's more cunning than all the patriarchs of the noble houses combined. Asterion huffed coldly. Gryffindor. The applause sounded even more grandiose as the Sorting Hat spoke. The Gryffindor table practically turned into a wave of noise and chaos. The noise naturally ceased when Professor McGonagall looked at the students of the house she oversaw. After all the new students were sorted into their respective houses, Albus Dumbledore gave a speech to all the students and ended with a strange phrase that nobody understood. Dinner was served, and everyone who was hungry ate eagerly. Asterion and Daphne ate in silence until the entire sorting ceremony officially ended. All students followed their respective prefects to the common rooms. The password to enter the common room is pure blood. If you forget, you'll have to sleep outside or hope someone opens it for you, the Slytherin prefect told all the new students. The Slytherin common room was located beneath the Black Lake. Casting a dim, slightly greenish illumination, the predominant color was green with touches of silver, giving the entire common room an elegant and cozy ambience. The chair next to the fireplace is the seat of the Slytherin leader, belonging to the strongest person in the entire house, the prefect continued, introducing everything to the new students. Asterion glanced at the chair and walked towards it. The prefect wanted to reprimand the arrogant new student, but upon seeing who it was, wisely remained silent. Sitting in the chair, Asterion crossed his legs and looked at all the members of the Slytherin house. His red eyes gained a phosphorescent hue, appearing especially sinister under the dim light of the room. Beside him, Baskerville materialized and rested his head in his master's lap, his 100 eyes coldly surveying the teenagers and young adults. From this day forth, I am the law, I am your king and ruler. I don't care what you think of me, but know that those who dare challenge me will suffer. His cold and regal voice sent shivers down people's spines. Looking at everyone for a moment, Asterion continued, during my reign at Hogwarts, I intend to change the entire Slytherin house. I don't want others to fear or despise us, I want the other houses to look at us and feel envy for not being in Slytherin. For those who obey my orders, I will personally teach and train them in private lessons on Saturdays. When Asterion said this, regardless of age or gender, everyone looked at him with excitement. They all knew he was the second special grade wizard in England, meaning they would be personally trained by one of the most important figures on the planet. At this moment, even if Asterion wanted to change the house crest, they would accept it without hesitation. The older students supervised the younger ones, reminding them not to forget the rules. Asterion stroked Baskerville's head in his lap. I'll give you one warning. Rose Potter is someone you cannot touch, she's a special grade witch. If you don't want to be humiliated, stay away from her. His final words made the faces of the older students change drastically. Perhaps the patriarchs of each noble house would hear about this news the next day. Rose Potter being a special grade witch changed everything, it meant that the Light faction possessed 2 special grade witches. Chapter 47, Chapter 45, Classroom, 1. September 2, 1993, Thursday. Hogwarts. As Asterion got ready in front of the full-length mirror, a curtain of darkness formed beside him, and from it emerged a creature resembling a bat, not large, almost the size of an adult man's palm. It looked somewhat cute, upon closer inspection. Go and find the Chamber of Secrets, Asterion spoke as he adjusted his green tie. The bat nodded obediently and transformed into thousands of bats, which soon disappeared, but Asterion knew they were only invisible in the room. Opening the door of the room with a spell, Asterion let the thousands of invisible bats out and closed the door to the room again. Early yesterday morning, Asterion took advantage of everyone being asleep and headed straight to the girls' bathroom determined to enter the Chamber of Secrets. Unfortunately, the chamber wasn't there. Someone had moved the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets to another location. As for who, there was only one option: Voldemort. Besides himself, he was the only descendant of Slytherin in this castle. But Asterion had to admit that the man worked fast, knowing that the Sorting Hat would likely inform him about the Chamber of Secrets. The Dark Lord wisely moved the chamber to another location. But it was a move destined to only delay the inevitable: he would find the Chamber of Secrets sooner or later. Seeing that he was properly presentable in the mirror's reflection, Asterion nodded satisfactorily and left the room with his wand in its holster. He had Transfiguration class in the morning, together with the Gryffindors. Asterion had to admit that releasing his bats was a smart move. Besides searching for the Chamber of Secrets, the bats also served as guides. He soon arrived back at the cafeteria. Besides him, there were 4 other awake students eating, 2 from Ravenclaw, 1 from Hufflepuff, and 1 from Gryffindor. In addition to the students, Dumbledore was seated in the head chair and waved to him, greeting him. Asterion nodded in response and sat at the Slytherin table. He quietly ordered the dishes he wanted, and magically, they appeared on the table. He had to admire the Hogwarts house elves. They were extremely efficient. Not surprising considering they served thousands of people every day. Asterion ordered a glass of wine to accompany his bread, eggs, and sausage, with mashed potatoes. But before starting to eat, he looked at Dumbledore and gestured to the seat next to him in the enormous chair that served as seating for everyone, clearly inviting him to join him for the meal. Dumbledore seemed surprised for a moment but then appeared seated beside him. He was the only one who could operate within the confines of Hogwarts, a feat ingeniously accomplished by Rowena Ravenclaw. "I'm over 100 years old, but this is the first time I've sat at the Slytherin table," Dumbledore said playfully. His blue eyes looked kindly at Asterion, ignoring the other shocked students as the situation unfolded in front of them. Asterion narrowed his eyes. Although Dumbledore had not sat at the Slytherin table, he had certainly spent a lot of time in Grindelwald's company, which was practically the same thing. "I met my cousin, Rose. She wasn't raised in the wizarding world." Eating a piece of toast, Asterion spoke while looking at the most powerful man in the world. Fame can sometimes go to people's heads, making them arrogant. "I didn't want that for little Rose," Dumbledore replied, ordering his own food, an authentic English breakfast with eggs, bacon, toast, tomatoes, roasted mushrooms, sausages, chorizo, and baked beans. "Yes, of course you didn't want that," Asterion emphasized the "you" very sarcastically. Dumbledore acted as if he hadn't heard his sarcasm and asked while eating a sausage, "How is Lord Arcturus?" "Last I saw him, he was as strong as a dragon." Feeling perhaps that Dumbledore knew about Arcturus's critical condition, Asterion responded coldly, "He's doing well, although he might dream of strangling you while he sleeps." Dumbledore just chuckled amusedly at his words. "We've always been rivals. He's one of the few people from my generation still alive," he spoke with a hint of nostalgia in his voice. Asterion truly didn't know if those words were true. The man in front of him was a true master at hiding his own emotions and showing what you wanted to see in order to get closer to you. Seeking to take control of the conversation from Dumbledore, Asterion asked, "Can I enroll in the exorcism course in advance?" The exorcism course was only accessible in the 4th year when students began to undertake missions, but Asterion didn't want to wait that long, especially since he would be called upon anyway to deal with special grade cursed spirits. Dumbledore stroked his long beard, pondering for a moment before responding. "It's not impossible for you, but your team would have to be adjusted. After all, you're still a special grade wizard, your missions would be extremely dangerous for someone below grade 1. He continued, "I'll speak to the school council, but don't expect a response too soon, young Asterion. Those old-fashioned sticklers don't like things that defy the rules, especially for someone like you, a special grade wizard." Asterion scoffed coldly at the man's words, but he knew Dumbledore wasn't lying. The more powerful someone was, the more guarded the people of this country would be, especially after the war 13 years ago, where the wizarding population in England dropped by almost 30%. No one wanted to see another Dark Lord anytime soon, especially him, where the House of Black had produced 7 Dark Lords over millennia. As mentioned earlier, no one would be surprised if Asterion declared himself a Dark Lord. But honestly, he didn't know how these people thought they could control him. Political power? Faced with absolute strength, such conspiracies were child's play. Perhaps that was the problem with politicians, they had been controlling the country for so long that they forgot the world was still ruled by the strongest fist. As Asterion and Dumbledore conversed, more and more students arrived at the cafeteria, and without exception, they were all shocked to see Dumbledore sitting at the Slytherin table. Especially the Slytherin members, who exchanged glances and saw the same look in each other's eyes. What to do in this situation? Sit next to Dumbledore? Everyone shook their heads suddenly and almost instantly dismissed the idea. After whispering quietly to each other, they all decided to make space and isolate the two, ignoring both of them for the time being. But before everyone sat down, they all greeted Asterion with respect and admiration in their eyes, regardless of their age. "Good morning, Lord Black." "Good morning, Lord Black." "Good morning, Lord Black." "You seem to have won everyone over rather quickly," Dumbledore remarked, noting the admiring glances the students gave Asterion. "Slytherin above all values self-preservation, the weak follow the strong. That's the law this world has followed since ancient times," Asterion spoke indifferently. "Blindly following a person isn't conducive to good, after all, we are human and we make mistakes much more than we'd like," Dumbledore offered his opinion, looking deeply at Asterion. "If a ruler is powerless, it will be reflected in their governance. Incompetence leads to ruin, ruin leads to death and destruction," Asterion countered, staring at the man without flinching. "No one likes to be controlled so deeply, it's inevitable that someone will rise against the system," Dumbledore spoke calmly. "That's inevitable, but when everyone receives benefits, the majority will ignore the minority. When everyone is satisfied, no one wants to pay attention to others." Asterion knew very well that human nature is inherently selfish. Everyone feels pity for someone, but few are willing to step out of their comfort zone to help someone in need. Dumbledore remained silent and looked at Asterion with his particularly bright blue eyes at that moment. Dumbledore finished his meal and apparat to the teacher's table. As soon as Dumbledore left, all the Slytherins sighed with relief. Sitting next to the enemy of their parents was not a pleasant feeling. It seemed like they were sitting on pins, they could barely stay still in their seats. Asterion felt an intense gaze upon him and looked towards the teacher's table, more precisely at the man with oily black hair and a particularly pronounced nose. Severus Snape, the potions professor. Asterion didn't know what the man was thinking, nor did he care. As a double agent like himself, the Blacker held a slight disdain for him. It wasn't because of Snape's choices, but rather due to what he naturally felt as someone who desired to reign. To a king, what he detested most was traitors. But at the same time, he wouldn't antagonize the man, he was nothing more than a chess piece destined to be discarded sooner or later. It was futile to harbor resentment for the dead. Author's thoughts: what did you think of the first dispute between Asterion and Dumbledore? A little boring? Yes, it's only their first date officially, expect a lot more, especially at the end of the first year. No spoilers. Chapter 48, Chapter 46, Classroom, 2. When Asterion continued to eat, Daphne and Tracy sat on both sides of him, preventing certain girls from getting close to him. Pansy clenched her teeth, watching this, the bread she was holding practically twisted in her hands. If the bread were conscious, perhaps it would lament its sad fate. It wasn't enough to be devoured, it had to suffer such torture. "Good morning," Daphne greeted him, kissing his cheek, the cold expression she usually wore around everyone seeming surprisingly kind at this moment. "Good morning," Asterion greeted her back, even Tracy, who sat on his left side. "I heard you were talking to Dumbledore at the Slytherin table," Daphne asked curiously. Tracy also listened with great curiosity. "I called him for a conversation, the conversation was at least enlightening," he replied, falling silent for a moment as he speared the sausage with his fork. Though it seemed like a simple divergence of ideologies, it was something deeper. That conversation meant Asterion and Dumbledore had no possibility of cooperation in the future. Dumbledore was content with the current system, where everyone maintained a fragile balance, keeping the entire society in relative peace. But for Asterion, it was the opposite. The Ministry of Magic had to cease to exist for him to control the entire British magical society. To create the god that the House of Black envisioned, the entire island of Great Britain had to be in his hands. In other words, Asterion would dismantle the existential order and establish a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, to be more precise. Absolutism wasn't suitable, centralized power in one person would only bring more problems than benefits. As Arcturus had mentioned before, the foundation of a society lay in the interests of the people. Daphne didn't ask any further, noting her silence. Aeran would tell her something if necessary. In addition to conversing with Daphne and Tracy, Aeran also spoke with the first years sitting near him. Surprisingly, he found it somewhat pleasant to converse with Blaise Zabani and Theodore Knott. Both showed respect for him, but they discussed interesting topics rather than typical teenage matters. "I heard your mother got married for the 5th time, Zabani," Theodore, a handsome boy with black hair and brown eyes, asked, looking at Blaise with a curious smile. Blaise, a very handsome black teenager, just groaned in frustration at his friend's question. "Yes, my former stepfather recently passed away, so she got married again." "How did your stepfather die?" Theodore continued to ask with a mischievous smile on his face. Blaise's mother was a beautiful and very charming woman, well known in aristocratic circles for her marriages, which always ended with her as a widow and a substantial amount of gold filling her coffers. With so many deaths, everyone naturally suspected that the woman was killing her own husbands to inherit the rich estates left by them. However, the Ministry of Magic's investigations always determined that they were accidental deaths or due to illnesses, sometimes even natural causes in some cases, dismissing suspicions against the woman. The ministry placed great importance on such cases. After all, it involved the inheritance of wizards, something quite delicate in England. Despite such a reputation, the line of suitors for the woman was surprisingly long. Everyone thought it was just simple bad luck. "He fell down the stairs and broke his neck," Blaise replied with a slightly disgusted expression, as if remembering something very unpleasant. Everyone around found the situation quite amusing. There was no denying it, Blaise's mother's husbands were indeed unlucky. Seeing this, Blaise just sighed and said nothing. Breakfast ended with Aeran, Daphne, and Tracy leaving together. Class was about to begin. Blaise and Theodore didn't try to get too close to Aeran, avoiding making the teenager feel uncomfortable with their sudden proximity. The first class of the day was Transfiguration in the morning. Entering the classroom with Daphne and Tracy by his side, Aeran quickly glanced at the teacher's desk and saw a cat staring at him with a gaze that closely resembled Professor McGonagall's. "Why is there a cat in the classroom?" Tracy murmured to herself as she tried to pet the cat, but to her disappointment, the cat skillfully dodged her hands with surprising grace. "Don't run away, I'm a good person," Tracy persisted. As a cat lover, she refused to let a feline go without any affection. Aeran, sitting in the back row of seats, watched the whole scene with an amused look dancing in his eyes. It wasn't every day that he would see the strict Professor McGonagall evading a student. "She hasn't noticed yet," Daphne said, her tone tired, as she sat beside Aeran. Under the table, her hand found his, intertwining their fingers. Aeran looked at her with a puzzled expression but didn't comment on her actions. Observing this, Daphne couldn't help but feel a deep admiration for her mother. The woman certainly knew how to win someone over. To any casual observer, simply holding hands wouldn't be anything extraordinary for betrothed couples, but initially, Aeran had been reluctant to even sit close to her. It wasn't out of dislike or for any other reason, her fiancé simply didn't feel comfortable around strangers, including herself, his fiancé. After sharing the situation with her mother, Helena tasked Daphne with a mission, to approach Aeran cautiously. First, she was to let him get used to her presence, subtly getting closer to him and touching him until he became accustomed to her touch. She did this for months, until finally managing to touch Aeran without him looking at her with coldness. Daphne had to admit that the routine was quite eerie. When you're accustomed to something, you hardly notice when that something happens. Even the inaccessible and indifferent Aeran Black wasn't immune to this. "Let her be, at least we can have some fun watching," Aeran replied, looking at Tracy chasing the cat around Professor McGonagall's desk. Seeing that she couldn't pet the cat, Tracy noticed that the class was about to begin, with more and more students arriving. Determined, she looked at the cat, promising herself that she would pet it in the future regardless of what happened. Seated beside Aeran, as she had promised Daphne, she occasionally gave fleeting glances to the cat. Rose and Hermione almost arrived late but finally entered before the appointed time. Unfortunately, a certain red-haired boy wasn't so lucky. Ron, who had just entered the classroom sweating, sighed in relief to see that the teacher hadn't arrived yet. However, as he prepared to sit down, the cat on the teacher's desk suddenly transformed into a middle-aged woman dressed in emerald robes, shocking all the students. or at least those who recognized the cat's identity. "Mr. Weasley, you're late," she said, addressing the boy with a gaze capable of intimidating any unruly teenager. "I got lost, Professor," Ron tried to explain, gaining some relief as he saw the teacher's expression soften slightly. After all, it wasn't uncommon for a first-year student to be late with Hogwarts' numerous confusing staircases. "You'd better not be late again, or I'll turn you into a pocket watch," she warned the boy with a cold look. McGonagall looked at the class with seriousness, her gaze briefly stopping at the frightened Tracy, but she continued after a brief pause. "Before we proceed with the lesson, I must inform you that Transfiguration is one of the most difficult and dangerous branches of magic. A simple mistake can turn something harmless into something perilous. Therefore, while you're in my class, I demand absolute attention, or I won't hesitate to expel the inattentive for an entire year." Her stern voice carried seriousness and authority, leaving almost all the students nervous, some even straightened up in their seats. As she noticed the entire class listening attentively, a look of satisfaction gleamed in her eyes, and she continued. "Transfiguration is the art of shaping matter with your will and determination." While Professor McGonagall taught the basics of Transfiguration, in the back of the classroom, Tracy complained to Daphne and Aeran. "You didn't tell me about Professor McGonagall." "Believe me, it was hilarious to watch you try to pet the professor," Daphne said with a mischievous smile on her lips, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "How cruel, Daph. You're getting more sadistic spending time with Asti." "You weren't like this before," Tracy said resentfully. Aeran just rolled his eyes at the nickname. Tracy was the only one who dared to call him that. It was something he obviously allowed, given that he had known her long enough and she helped him keep the girls from getting too close to him. Believe him when he says that teenagers are surprisingly annoying. Every time he attended a ball over the years, he found himself completely surrounded by girls, something that particularly annoyed him, as he had a slight dislike for the touch of strangers. "It's better to focus on the class, the professor has already started to notice your whispers," Aeran murmured discreetly to the girls while keeping his eyes on the lesson, efficiently taking notes of Professor McGonagall's words. He would never let the words of a Transfiguration master like Minerva McGonagall, who had won several international awards, pass him by. Daphne and Tracy stopped their discussion and focused on the lesson. "Author's thoughts, how was the first class? I don't know if McGonagall's personality was good, did I make her too severe?" Chapter 49, Chapter 47, Classroom, 3. While taking notes during Transfiguration class, Aeran felt one of his bats had been killed. The last image transmitted to him was of a tall, muscular teenager with black hair and blue eyes. Even though 3 years had passed, he recognized the one person who lacked magical energy, Neville Longbottom. Aeran furrowed his brow, trying to recall Neville at the sorting ceremony, but found he wasn't there. Yet, clad in red and gold robes, the eldest Longbottom had been sorted into Gryffindor. But he shouldn't have been, for he lacked magical energy and wasn't even qualified to enter Hogwarts in the first place, unless Dumbledore needed another squib like Finch. Interesting. With the pen placed against his lips, Aeran displayed a slightly sadistic look. Dumbledore must have really pulled some strings to let Neville into Hogwarts. Don't think the prejudice against Neville was exaggerated. In a society based on magical supremacy, someone without magic was extremely discriminated against. Many squibs weren't even worthy of being recorded in the family tree. As Aeran pondered deeply, unaware that Daphne and Tracy were staring at him intently. "Your fiancé is dangerous, Daph," Tracy murmured, feeling her heart race faster. Despite spending a lot of time with Aeran, she wasn't immune to that devilishly handsome appearance. Especially when he wore that wicked expression on his face, which made him ridiculously SE*Y, just like the villains in the erotic novels she secretly read away from her mother's prying eyes. "I have to stop falling in love with the villains in books, but it's not my fault. The protagonists lack so much charisma and are only slightly handsome," Tracy thought, with a helpless look in her brown eyes. Daphne agreed with her friend's words, but at the same time, she found it incredibly exhausting to keep the girls away from Aeran. It wasn't just once or twice that she had to have a private conversation with the Slytherin girls. Although she felt her efforts were futile, the girls seemed to agree with her words, but deep down, they probably thought completely differently. Having a handsome and incredibly powerful fiancé had proven incredibly difficult, but she wouldn't give up. Aeran was hers by right, and she wouldn't let any excited bitches get near him. "Your first lesson is to transform this matchbox into a needle," Professor McGonagall spoke as dozens of matchboxes flew into the air with a wave of her wand. Each matchbox landed directly in front of each student. The closer to the perfect appearance of a needle, the more points you'll earn at the end of the lessons, she continued, her intense gaze sweeping over each teenager in the classroom. Everyone nodded and drew their wands, chanting the incantation taught by Professor McGonagall. Commutare. Obviously, there were no changes in the matchboxes. Wrong, you have to believe. The key word is believe. If you don't believe you can do it, neither will magic. Passing by a Slytherin student, Professor McGonagall patiently explained, regardless of the fact that the boy was from a rival house. After that, she went from table to table, helping the students, regardless of their house. Perhaps that's why Professor McGonagall was popular in all four houses despite her strict demeanor. Rose, next to Hermione, gently waved her wand and silently muttered the incantation. Instantly, the matchbox changed its square shape, narrowing and then rounding, and a silver needle appeared on the table. 10 points to Gryffindor. Looking at the perfectly silver and pointed needle, Professor McGonagall exclaimed aloud. Excellent work, Miss Potter. It's the first time in 40 years that a student has managed to transform a matchbox into a needle in their first lesson. Professor McGonagall expressed her appreciation in her words. Thank you, Professor, Rose responded with a smile. Keep it up, Miss Potter, but try to challenge yourself. Show me the results at the end of the class, she said, then walked over to another student behind Rose. Hermione looked at Rose with a spark shining in her eyes. I won't lose, Rose, the girl said resolutely. Then let's compete to see who earns more points by the end of the month, Rose suggested, leaning her head on her hand with a playful look. She truly appreciated Hermione. Instead of feeling envious like other girls, her friend aimed to better herself. This was rare for Rose, who had always been the target of other girls' envy because of her appearance. Having a genuine friend for the first time was a breath of fresh air. At the back of the classroom, Aeran transfigured the matchbox into a needle on his first attempt. It wasn't a challenge for him in the first place. He already had plenty of experience in such matters, especially in creating cursed spirits in the form of objects like swords and armor. Transfiguring a matchbox into a needle wasn't difficult for him at all. He even adorned the needle with intricate figures of several crows along the small silver shaft. Having a wand proved quite useful in these minute details, it helped him control the precision almost surgically. Then, Aeran heard a loud voice beside him. 20 points to Slytherin. Looking to the side, he found Professor McGonagall looking at him with a gaze full of praise. Good job, Mr. Black. Magnificent work. If you weren't a first year, I would have suspected I was looking at the work of a fifth-year student, she spoke, sparing no compliments. Thank you. I have the best teacher possible, Aeran replied with a calm demeanor. Unbeknownst to him, a subtle smile appeared on his lips. Being praised by this admirable woman was a very pleasant feeling. It wasn't the shallow flattery he had always heard from others. Indeed, Minerva also felt quite happy to be praised sincerely. After all, everyone enjoys compliments, regardless of age or gender. I'll say the same words I said to Miss Potter. Challenge yourself, the only limitation in Transfiguration is your mind, she said, then glanced at Daphne beside Aeran. She looked at the needle, which could hardly be considered a needle, and said, 5 points to Slytherin. Miss Greengrass, you didn't focus enough during the Transfiguration process. Remember, focus is crucial during Transfiguration. Any mistake will reflect in what you are trying to transfigure, the woman explained the errors Daphne made with a stern voice. Thank you, Professor, Daphne sincerely thanked her. After the professor left, Tracy looked at the two and spoke nonchalantly, you two are monsters. I could only briefly change the matchbox. For Aeran, such a result is normal given his inherent technique. Mine is also quite favorable for Transfiguration, but the real monster is Rose Potter. Her inherent technique isn't directly related to Transfiguration, yet she can transfigure on the first try. That insane control over magical energy is really hard to imagine, Daphne murmured, still feeling amazed by the performance of the six-eyed bearer. With the help of those eyes, she was practically born for Transfiguration. With her subatomic control over magic, Aeran spoke calmly, while constantly changing the needle on the table. Instead of changing the object itself, he altered the material, color, and even texture. Doing something that many seventh-year students would never achieve. After all, few people are truly interested in Transfiguration, most prefer spells or runes. That's the difference between someone talented and someone who lacks talent. Something someone trained for 20 years cannot be compared to a genius who achieved it in just 1 year. It's truly unfair, but nothing in this world is fair. Is she really that amazing? Tracy asked curiously. Give her a month, and with her control, she could probably transfigure you into a noodle, Daphne joked, looking at her friend with a mischievous grin. Even though Tracy knew Daphne was joking, she felt a chill run down her spine. I think I won't be getting too close to her, she said with a smile that was slightly unnerved. Aeran rolled his eyes at the girl's banter and focused on the lesson. Transfiguration class ended about 2 hours later. Rose earned 25 points for Gryffindor, Aeran 30, Daphne 10, and Hermione 10. This added up to 40 points for Slytherin and 35 for Gryffindor. Almost inevitably, the classroom divided into two sides, on one side, the Slytherin students, and on the other, the Gryffindor students, each trying to outdo the other. Aeran realized that the school seemed to be fostering this division on purpose. However, this separatism between the houses was something more serious, it could become something bigger if not handled well. Nevertheless, all students had only 10 minutes to get to the next class, which posed a challenge for the first years. The Slytherins were lucky to have Aeran guiding them to the dim and damp potions classroom. Aeran didn't like the dark and humid atmosphere of the potions classroom, nor did he like the subject at hand. Potions were not something he wanted to get involved with, he was terrible at those magical recipes. Potions, alchemy, and predicting the future were areas he wanted to stay away from. He couldn't stand still in front of a cauldron or involve himself in the complicated processes of alchemy. Predicting the future was something he especially detested, especially after the encounter with Grindelwald at his birthday party. That chilling smile on the man's face while he clapped still sent shivers down Aeran's spine. But make no mistake, although he was terrible at making potions, he recognized the value of potions that could potentially save his life at some point. He kept a stock of vials containing a variety of potions in the stomach of a cursed spirit specially created to hold things. Though it cost a considerable amount of gold, he was wealthy and cared little for the expense, even if it amounted to tens of thousands of golden coins. Fortunately, during this potions class, his fiancée was an excellent practitioner of the discipline, which was to be expected given her background in the green grass family. When all the students arrived promptly in the classroom, a man whom Aeran almost thought was Batman entered, dressed in a long dark cloak that seemed too large. His hollow, dark eyes watched everyone, his gaze briefly stopping at Rose before continuing until it landed on Aeran, who looked back at him with an indifferent and particularly cold stare. I do not expect you to understand the beauty of potions. This branch of magic performs true miracles in the form of liquids. I can change your appearance, make you experience love, save you when you are dying, even manipulate your luck. In this class, you will not simply wave your wand stupidly, you will follow my orders, and if you do not, you had better be prepared for the consequences. Snape's cold voice echoed through the dark and damp classroom, making the students feel slightly frightened by the eerie atmosphere, and even more unsettled by him. The sound of people swallowing was particularly audible in this silent environment. Aeran didn't conceal his dislike on his face. If Minerva McGonagall was a teacher worthy of the sacred title of educator, Severus Snape was the opposite. The man shouldn't be teaching anyone, let alone children. The disinterest in his voice was as clear as the bitter man's monotonous life. Snape picked up a parchment with the names of the students and began the roll call. As he looked at a specific name, he directed his cold gaze towards Rose. Oh, a celebrity, the girl who lived, what an honor, he said with obvious sarcasm in his voice. Rose simply smiled widely at the professor's words. Sorry, I don't give autographs to humanoid bats, she replied, her own sarcasm not concealed. With Rose's voice echoing, everyone, regardless of their house, turned their gazes towards her with veiled admiration on their faces. Snape's face twitched slightly. -10 points for Gryffindor for answering back to the professor, Snape said, looking coldly at Rose. You might as well take all the points at once, because every time you speak, I'll respond right back, Rose replied, smiling broadly, her hands behind her head. Her incredibly blue eyes stared at Snape with clear amusement dancing in them. They both stared intensely at each other, but Snape finally looked away. Aeran didn't know if the man would be as brave once he realized he had offended a special grade witch, news that probably had already spread in aristocratic circles. Women could be especially vengeful, Bellatrix was a clear example of that. She had killed Rodolphus's mistress and child in front of the patriarch of the Lestrange family. Snape still didn't know who he was dealing with. Rose didn't seem like someone who would tolerate injustices quietly. The class continued as normal, with Gryffindor losing more and more points for every basic mistake made. On the other hand, Daphne earned more points, while Aeran only assisted her with the potion ingredients. Another person earning points was Draco's twin sister, Doria Malfoy. Speaking of Doria, the teenager was practically a copy of Narcissa, both in mannerisms and in her innate arrogance. Aeran didn't sense any trace of negative magical energy in the girl, which meant she didn't practice the simplified inherent technique of the Black family, but rather the inherent technique of the Malfoy family, the Wheel of Fortune. It was mostly a passive ability, aimed at seeing luck and even manipulating it to some extent. The ancestor of the Malfoy family in France had performed true miracles with this technique, but in the hands of Lucius Malfoy, this ability hadn't worked out very well, as the losses he suffered and continues to suffer in the 13-year war still haunt him to this day. Like her twin brother, Doria looked at Aeran with clear dissatisfaction in her blue eyes but didn't dare to reprimand him, perhaps due to her father's orders. As for the siblings' dissatisfaction, Aeran was very clear. Both resented him for taking Narcissa away from them, which was contradictory because neither of the twins cared about their mother until they finally realized how much they missed her. Only then did they demonstrate resentment towards Aeran. On the Gryffindor side, Hermione showed a certain talent for potions. The potions she brewed were acceptable, but Snape never awarded any points to the brown-haired girl. This deeply irritated Hermione, but unfortunately, her resentment meant nothing in the face of Snape's pleasure in punishing Gryffindor for the slightest mistake. The disgust Aeran felt for Snape deepened even further. He ardently wished to send Baskerville to devour the piece of trash that was the man, but he held back in the end. Creating a murder scandal on the first day of class wasn't something he desired. Perhaps in the second or third week. However, Hermione's friend didn't stay silent about what was happening. Rose didn't miss the chance to mock Snape, making the professor's cold face appear even more expressionless. This forced the man to use his occlumency skills to the fullest, not showing any emotion in the face of the white-haired girl's sarcastic comments. After 2 hours of class, all the students, even those from Slytherin, couldn't stand being in that environment anymore and almost ran out of the classroom. As it was lunch break, everyone headed to the cafeteria. The Gryffindors were unusually silent. Obviously, everyone was disheartened by the previous lesson, especially knowing they would have many more classes with Snape in the future. "I can't believe that man is a teacher," Hermione said through clenched teeth. She had never been punished by a teacher in her life. Her exemplary conduct was something she prided herself on, but that shining record of years had been tarnished countless times today. You can imagine the girl's anger at this moment. "Don't worry about that trash, my own. We can earn many more points in other classes," Rose comforted the girl, hugging her from behind. Since Hermione was smaller than Rose, she fit perfectly in the white-haired girl's arms. Hermione's cheeks flushed with the sudden embrace, but she didn't pull away from her friend. "Still, the points we earned in Professor McGonagall's class disappeared, and Slytherin is at the top of the house standings. At this rate, we'll lose the house cup," Hermione murmured, still dissatisfied with the treatment she received from Snape. Rose just laughed and didn't mind, continuing to comfort her friend regardless of the people around her. In the cafeteria, Aeran, Daphne, and Tracy sat at the Slytherin table to eat, and as they were about to start eating, they saw a white-haired teenager walking towards the Slytherin table and sitting down, regardless of the shocked looks from everyone in the cafeteria. Little Star Rose greeted Aeran with a smile. When she said that, everyone at the Slytherin table grimaced, and when someone was about to laugh, a friend next to them reminded them and held back the laughter. Aeran couldn't help but want to punch Rose's pretty face. The girl knew exactly how to irritate him. "What do you want, Snowflake?" he said coldly, looking at her. He just wanted to finish this conversation quickly and eat. "Well, I want to know why Snape dislikes me so much," Rose asked without caring about Aeran's cold look, as she ordered her own food, seemingly planning to have lunch at the Slytherin table. "Your father stole the woman he loved, what do you think?" Aeran replied sarcastically. My lovely mother was quite popular," Rose chuckled after hearing Aeran's words. Not only did she hear, but everyone at the table heard. Aeran didn't lower his voice and spoke slightly louder than usual. Hearing about Severus Snape's life was definitely something everyone wanted, they even forgot there was a Gryffindor sitting at the Slytherin table. Aeran continued to speak, regardless of how many listened. He even wanted all of Hogwarts to hear his words. But it's not just that. Your father, James Potter, and my uncle, Sirius Black, were the main ones who made his life at Hogwarts a complete hell. Our relatives weren't exactly nice at our age, if you catch my drift. Asterion spoke, knowing about Rose's troubled childhood, even probable abuses by her maternal Muggle family. The smile on Rose's face vanished with Asterion's words. She didn't expect her father to be someone like Dudley. This left a lasting bitter taste in her mouth. It seemed like the sins of the fathers fell upon the son, meaning her. Fortunately, she wasn't a helpless girl like when she was a child who didn't know anything. Thank you for telling me. Rose sincerely thanked him and left with her food, returning to the Gryffindor table. That was surprisingly informative. Theodore Nott spoke, breaking the silence among them. Who would have expected Snape's hatred towards Gryffindor to be like that? Tracy sighed as her eyes still burned with curiosity. She continued speaking with an excited look. A love triangle that turned into a relationship full of hatred and resentment. I think I could write a book based on this. Everyone around rolled their eyes at her dramatic words. Chapter 50, Chapter 48, First Class of Defense Against Cursed Spirits, 1. After lunch, there were still 3 classes left, flying at 3 p.m. and, at the end of the day, History of Magic, the last class being the most special. The first one was taught by Professor Binns, a ghost who had died in his sleep and continued to teach to this day. The second one was led by Madame Hooch, a woman with piercing yellow eyes, reminiscent of a hawk's eyes. The flying class itself didn't catch Asterion's attention. He could fly on his own without any problem. But as a man, he felt particularly revolted sitting on those broomsticks. Even after years living in the magical society, he still didn't understand how witches and wizards could sit on those brooms without hurting their private parts. That was the first flying class and the last one he would attend because he would never sit on a broom again. Instead of hurting himself by sitting on a broom, he would rather ride Nidhogg and fly on top of a damn dragon. As for what the school would think of him skipping classes, Asterion couldn't care less. If anyone complained, Baskerville was especially hungry those days, and he wouldn't mind feeding his faithful companion. The penultimate class of the day was History of Magic, during which Asterion nearly dozed off while hearing about the Goblin Rebellion and the Giant Wars, topics as antiquated as Professor Binns himself. The ghost seemed to have a strange enthusiasm for history, something the Black-Heir couldn't comprehend. After the end of the History of Magic class, it was time for the class Asterion was slightly interested in, Defense Against Cursed Spirits, taught by Edward Milleden, a veteran Auror from the Ministry of Magic. This class was one of the 2 that were exclusive to the reality of this magical world, the other being magical self-defense tactical training. Edward was a middle-aged man, around 40 years old, with partially grey hair and cold grey eyes. A scar marked his face below the eyes, extending to the jaw. He wore black trousers and a grey vest over a white shirt. His posture was firm and imposing, like someone who had witnessed many things and faced many challenges. The Defense Against Cursed Spirits class took place in a vast open space, with students from all 4 houses present, hundreds of teenagers nervously watching the professor. Asterion's small group was in the front row of Slytherin members. Are we going to face cursed spirits on the first day? Tracy murmured, clearly nervous, as she looked at the cages behind the professor with a hint of fear in her eyes. No one responded to her, even Daphne seemed nervous. Perhaps the only people who appeared perfectly calm were Asterion and Rose, and as for the reason for this calmness, it didn't need explaining. Edward looked at all his students in silence and began to speak, his voice reaching everyone present effortlessly. I am Professor Edward Milleden, the instructor for Defense Against Cursed Spirits. He paused to let everyone process the information and continued, unlike Defense Against the Dark Arts, which specializes in combating dark wizards and shadowy creatures such as vampires, werewolves, and others, this class is exclusively focused on efficiently combating cursed spirits. Walking across the floor covered in brown tiles, he gestured towards the huge cages covered with white sheets behind him. Some of you may have noticed the cages behind me, and as you might imagine, they contain cursed spirits. As he said this, all the students became agitated, and not without reason. Regardless of their background, they were, after all, just teenagers and had never seen a particularly fierce cursed spirit without parental supervision. Silence, Edward frowned, speaking coldly. His rough, cold voice made the agitated teenagers fall silent. In this class, we won't be fighting cursed spirits. The goal is simply to get you accustomed to seeing them, which will help prevent you from freezing completely when encountering them on your future missions. His words alleviated some of the tension in the room, but only slightly. Everyone was still nervous. That said, he waved his wand and removed the sheets covering the cages, revealing the cursed spirits. In the 4 cages made of a special alchemical material, 4 cursed spirits appeared, all 4 of them as grotesque as possible, clearly chosen to make a significant impact on the new students. Disgusting. That was the sentiment shared by everyone as they saw the grotesque monsters writhing in the cages. Some, with more sensitive minds, bent over and vomited immediately. No one blamed or mocked these teenagers. The cursed spirits in the cages were truly disgusting, with a repulsive mass of fat and eyes that twisted grotesquely. Edward spoke calmly, his grey eyes observing everyone with serenity. Some of you are here to determine whether you will be assigned to the exorcism course or the auxiliary course. Although the school may make this choice based on your performance at the end of the school year, it respects your opinions. Therefore, you can choose now whether you want to remain in the exorcism course or switch to the auxiliary course. He continued calmly, there is no shame in being in the auxiliary course. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. If you believe you will do better in the auxiliary course, do not hesitate to make that choice. But it's not necessary to decide now, you have until the end of the school year to choose. Otherwise, the school will make the decision for you. Every word from Edward had a profound impact on the hearts of these teenagers, who expected a world full of brightness and magic. However, reality was cruel, they were not just students but soldiers in training. Let's begin, he said. Unlike humans, cursed spirits can regenerate infinitely as long as they have negative magical energy, so the easiest method to kill them in most cases is to cut off the head and destroy the body. But it's not a mandatory rule. Some may still survive even with their body cut into 4 parts. Edward continued his lecture regardless of what the students were thinking. To provide an example, he drew his wand and incanted a spell towards the cursed spirit in the cage. Bombarda. A red flash appeared at the tip of Edward's wand and struck the cursed spirit, exploding a significant portion of the creature, splattering purple blood to the sides, staining the ground with a purple hue, and a putrid smell hung in the air. Such a bloody scene left all the students pale, but they all looked with a certain curiosity as the monstrosity regenerated extremely quickly, and within seconds, it seemed intact again, as if nothing had happened. Indifferent to the bloody scene, Edward lowered his wand and explained sternly, that's the healing factor of cursed spirits, so when you're on a mission, never let your guard down under any circumstances, as like any living creature, cursed spirits also have a basic instinct for self-preservation. Listening to the entire lecture and vivid example, Aeran nodded in satisfaction. Edward was worthy of being a veteran orator, the man knew how to teach survival without kind and flowery words. The reality was much crueler, as the man personally demonstrated. He's a good teacher, not a charlatan with blonde hair and impeccably white teeth, Aeran said to his small, private group, not forgetting to ridicule a certain plagiarizing writer. Though they didn't quite understand the second part, everyone nodded in agreement with his words. They could also see that Edward was a good teacher. He didn't hesitate to expose cruelty and blood to the new students, shattering the beautiful illusion that teenagers had about the wizarding world. Chapter 51, Chapter 49, First Class of Defense Against Cursed Spirits, 2. Are you okay, my own? Rose asked, concerned, observing her friend's pale face. Just shocked by everything, Hermione whispered, looking at the purple blood spreading with a repugnant sound. She knew about cursed spirits, but she had only seen small and insignificant ones until now. Witnessing one so grotesque up close and the bloody scene deeply impacted her. For the first time, she felt that the wizarding world wasn't as bright as she had previously imagined. It was a world based on blood and power, cold and prejudiced against people like her. However, the curly-haired girl didn't let herself be frightened for long. She had the determination to stand firm in this world, and she would. She didn't want to be just another statistic reported on TV and would protect her parents. Rose, have you seen worse? Hermione asked without taking her eyes off the cursed spirits in the cages. Yes, much worse. These monsters are truly disgusting when they're devouring people. Rose didn't hold back and spoke calmly. In her eyes, it was much better for Hermione to get used to the concept of death as soon as possible to avoid accidentally harming herself in the future. Hermione seemed to take a deep breath, clenching her fists as she spoke. Rose, can you help me get stronger? I won't go easy on you, my own, Rose said, looking at the girl with a smile. No need to go easy, Hermione replied determinedly. Rose smiled and continued to listen to the professor. Each house, form a line and approach the cages, Edward ordered coldly, regardless of the pale faces of the teenagers. In the Slytherin line. Don't you dare vomit on me, Zabanai, Theodore taunted his friend with a challenging look. Those are my words, Blaise replied calmly. Boys are so childish, Tracy murmured, rolling her eyes as she watched the two. Beside her, Daphne nodded in agreement as she approached Asterion, seeking some comfort as she leaned her body against his. Unfortunately for her, Asterion simply coldly withdrew and said, Daphne, I understand it's scary, but you must face your fears head-on. Seeking comfort won't save you in the future. Daphne felt abandoned upon hearing his cold words. Although she knew he said it for her own good, she still looked at her future husband with resentment and turned her face away, refusing to meet his gaze. Then, Daphne and Tracy muttered quietly to each other, casting critical glances at Asterion. Asterion simply shrugged, indifferent. He wouldn't go easy on her just because she would be his wife, on the contrary, he would be especially demanding of her. Although Daphne's chances of becoming a special grade witch were slim, they were much higher than most witches. With rigorous training and a bit of luck, Daphne would have a significant chance of achieving that status. The first in line from Slytherin was Asterion, who looked boredly at the cursed spirit. Unlike the other first-year students, he was familiar with cursed spirits, especially with the horrible taste they left behind. I heard of your work exorcising special-grade cursed spirits, Lord Black, Edward said, looking at Asterion with hidden admiration behind his stern gaze. Not as good as I hoped, Asterion murmured, staring coldly at the cursed spirit. Suddenly, the image of 20,000 bodies flooded his mind, and for a brief moment, his bloodlust leaked out, drastically lowering the temperature around him. The students around felt a sudden chill and rubbed their arms, puzzled by the sudden drop in temperature. Lord Black, Edward spoke with a tone louder than usual. Asterion snapped out of his reverie and looked apologetically at the man, suppressing his bloodlust. Professor, will these images ever disappear? Asterion asked in a low voice. After that, one by one, everyone faced their fears head-on. Some were terrified, others vomited again at the sight of a cursed spirit up close, while some tried to appear calm, or at least, controlled. But Asterion doubted that any student present would dream of anything good tonight. This was a truly memorable experience for everyone. The class ended with the last person facing the cursed spirits. The next Defense Against Cursed Spirits class will be in a month, by which time you will probably have learned some lethal spells from Professor Flitwick, announced Edward, his voice echoing and capturing everyone's attention. A shared thought formed in the minds of the students. We're going to fight cursed spirits. Yes, it's exactly as you're thinking, you'll be facing cursed spirits, confirmed Edward, as if he were reading their minds, his cold voice reinforcing everyone's concerns. He continued regardless of the incredulous expressions on their faces. Before you go, I'll give you a tip. Instead of socializing and playing with friends, I advise you to study well. Because I'll only help you when your life is at risk, which means I'll remain indifferent to broken bones and fractured ribs. Everyone swallowed hard upon hearing this. They definitely wouldn't die, but the prospect of getting hurt was almost a certainty in the professor's words. It terrified them completely. No one wanted to end up with a broken arm or leg, especially while fighting cursed spirits. Unconcerned with the students' reaction, Edward left without looking back, leaving behind hundreds of students alone with the cursed spirits still in the cages. The atmosphere became even more tense and frightening. The outdoor classroom quickly emptied out, with students practically running outside. Even with the cursed spirits still trapped, no one wanted to be near them without a teacher present. Asterion almost laughed seeing everyone panicked, thinking they would have to face a powerful cursed spirit. He was almost certain they would be grade 4 or 3 cursed spirits, nothing too dangerous, but the students didn't seem to think so. Daph, I'm going to study hard from now on, said Tracy, wiping the sweat from her forehead. She was clearly nervous about the class next month. Daphne beside her also didn't seem calm at all. The news came very suddenly, and she was still processing the whole situation, even though she was almost a grade 1 witch. It showed how lack of experience could affect even someone with some training like her. Even the most talkative in the group, Theodore, was silent, thinking about the next class. Blaise seemed to be the calmest of the group, his expression remaining serene despite the tense atmosphere. They can't do this? If something happens to me, I'll tell my father, exclaimed a loud and fearful voice, causing everyone to look at the platinum blonde teenager with a strange look. If I were your sister, I'd break off my engagement, Tracy said with a playful tone, the teenager managing to change the entire atmosphere of the class with her sudden outburst. Daphne looked at Draco and shook her head, thanking Merlin that her husband would be Asterian, not Draco. Although Asterian seemed cold most of the time, she knew that behind that icy exterior, he was a lovely and loving marshmallow with his own family. Compared to the spoiled Draco, Asterian was the perfect husband in her eyes, powerful, handsome, coming from a powerful family, and loving, in his own cold way. The other members of Slytherin couldn't help but look strangely at the Malfoy heir. So what if his father was part of the school board? This was Hogwarts, even the most powerful wizard in the world couldn't control it, let alone his father. Doria Malfoy even distanced herself from her twin brother when she noticed the looks she was receiving. She glanced irritably at Draco and remained silent. Even if she said something, he would ignore her. It had always been like that. Her father, Lucius, always favored Draco over her, despite her showing more talent. But in his eyes, she was just a girl who would marry and leave the family. Author's thoughts: I think I wrote the Draco personality right. Well, Lucius being patriarchy isn't surprising. Chapter 52, Chapter 50, Request, 1. 3 weeks later. In the Hufflepuff common room, a young adult was holding her own purple hair in frustration. Why is it so hard to talk to him? Tonks lamented, collapsing onto the couch, her voice laden with helplessness and sadness. Her hair changed color from purple to grey. She had tried to reach out to her cousin, but he spent most of his days in the Slytherin common room, and when he wasn't there, he was in the library in the forbidden section where she couldn't enter. During classes, they couldn't meet since she was in her 7th year and he was in his 1st, it was as if fate was conspiring to keep them apart forever. Tonks didn't want to resort to it, but she was considering breaking into the Slytherin common room, which was a terrible idea. If caught, all Slytherins would be her enemies, and she might even be expelled for breaking one of Hogwarts' most important rules. Biting her nails anxiously, she made a decision: screw the consequences. Her hair suddenly changed from grey to pink. Tonks stood up, leaving the Hufflepuff common room, and suddenly changed her appearance, transforming into a Ravenclaw student. She walked through the corridors of Hogwarts in search of a Slytherin, something she had never imagined herself doing. After a while, she spotted a platinum blonde teenage girl with an arrogant demeanor. She recognized the girl as Doria Malfoy, one of the 2 princesses of Slytherin, alongside Daphne Greengrass, the Ice Queen. The girl was a typical Slytherin through and through. Seeing Doria heading towards the library, Tonks felt a surge of determination. As she turned the corner, she transformed into Doria and confidently strode towards the dungeons, where the Slytherin common room was located, beneath the Black Lake. Upon reaching the entrance, Tonks looked at the massive door adorned with a silver serpent and didn't hesitate to speak the password. Pure blood. As the door opened, a smug smile formed on Tonks' lips. Slytherins were easily predictable, and this time was no different. Upon entering the common room, Tonks couldn't help but widen her eyes at the luxury and elegance of the place. It was a bit dim, but the entire ambience seemed magnificent and filled with refinement, in shades of green, silver, and black. The black wooden furniture was beautifully carved with snakes. The whole room was a spectacle to behold. Tonks didn't want to admit it, but she felt a twinge of envy. It seemed like the entire school budget had been invested in the Slytherin common room. Shaking her head to refocus, she searched for her cousin, and to her surprise, she found him. He was by the fireplace, seated on an elegant chair that looked more like a throne than a simple seat. He read a newspaper while a nearly empty glass of wine rested on the nearby side table. Tonks couldn't help but feel that her cousin certainly knew how to enjoy life. At the same time, she couldn't help but notice that he looked like one of those villainous princes that would make any teenager fall for the bad boy vibe. As she pondered this, Tonks approached arrogantly and sat in the chair next to him, a chair that resembled a throne, but more elegant and silver in color, unlike the black throne where her cousin was seated. Asterian noticed her presence and furrowed his brow in confusion. "Hello, Asterian," she said with a sweet and gentle voice, like a teenager vaguely expressing her crush. Tonks was secretly proud of her performance, she felt like she deserved an Oscar. But his next words made Tonks' body stiffen, her presumption disappearing as quickly as it came. "You're not Doria." Asterian couldn't help but feel a certain amusement with the situation before him. "So, who are you?" Closing the newspaper, Asterian asked, his eyes shining with slight interest. He observed the fake Doria and noticed that her magical aura was similar to Doria's, but Doria Malfoy herself didn't like him, so it was impossible for her to speak in that tone with him, especially sitting on the throne he had prepared for Daphne beside him. Hierarchy in Slytherin was strict, and such an act of disrespect would not be tolerated. Suddenly, to his surprised eyes, Doria's appearance began to undergo an impressive transformation. Her body changed, first in height, then in skin color, followed by facial features, and finally, her hair. Aeran watched the transformation with interest. In place of the blonde, emerged a young adult with purple hair and black eyes. She bore a certain resemblance to someone he knew, especially in the cheekbones. Aeran recognized the process. The young woman was a metamorphomagus, a talent that seemed to commonly appear in the Black family. A very powerful talent for infiltration and combat, as it could alter even the body's composition, making it as hard as steel or as light as a feather. The young woman had a somewhat embarrassed smile, which Aeran could understand. "If you wanted to get close to me, you should have chosen my fiancé or Tracy. Both are close to me, unlike Doria, who hates me to the core," commented Aeran as he finished the last sip of wine in his glass. "But it didn't seem like she hated you, in the occasions I saw you two together," the woman asked, confused. "Well, Slytherin has a rule, to be united outside the common room. Conflicts should always remain within the common room." The young woman opened her mouth, surprised and unsure of what to say. "So, who are you?" Aeran asked again, his red eyes shining slightly as he observed the young woman beside him. Nymph squirmed in her chair and spoke with an embarrassed tone, "I know it must be strange, but I'm your cousin, Nymph Tonks." Aeran's expression remained unchanged. "Aren't you surprised?" Nymph asked, noticing his lack of reaction to the revelation. "I have many cousins, Miss Tonks." "One more is not so surprising," replied Aeran, reaching for a bottle of wine from the shadow beside him and refilling his glass. "But let's talk about you. Why did you come to me?" Swirling the glass in smooth, circular motions, he asked, looking at her with his red eyes. Honestly, he already knew who Nymph was, or rather, Nymphadora. Author's thoughts: poor Nymphadora, she chose the wrong person to transform into. Chapter 53, Chapter 51, Request, 2. "I am the daughter of Andromeda Tonks, but before marrying my father, she was called Black," explained Tonks, looking at her cousin, who showed no surprise at her revelation. She felt a sense of loss, as this encounter was not unfolding as she had thought. Her hair changed from purple to a dull blue. Initially, she had hoped Aeran would be pleased to discover he had another relative, but the teenager seemed colder than the iceberg that sank the Titanic. "I know who you are, Nymphadora," Aeran said, cutting off any further introduction. "But don't call me Nymphadora." Her cousin spoke in a loud, angry tone, her hair changing color to a fiery red, full of life. Aeran observed the change with interest. It seemed her cousin didn't have good control over her gift, which was not surprising. She hadn't had a teacher or access to the Black family heritage, which likely contained numerous books about her gift. "I apologize, I didn't realize being called by your name was so embarrassing." Aeran spoke with an uncertain tone. "When you're the butt of jokes because of your name, you start to dislike it," Tonks huffed, responding with an irritated look on her face. "Surely it must not be very pleasant," Aeran nodded. "But you shouldn't care about what people say about you. By showing that you care about what others say about you, you become weak in their eyes." Tonks opened her mouth in shock, not knowing what to say. She still couldn't believe she was receiving advice from a 13-year-old boy. Embarrassed and angry, she looked at her cousin resentfully. Aeran pursed his lips abnormally in the face of that resentful look. He didn't understand how he had made her angry, he had just given advice. In his eyes, women were definitely strange and somewhat illogical. Even without a valid reason to be upset, they found something entirely different and blamed you for it. Daphne was just like Nymphadora in this regard. "So, what did you want to do after meeting me?" Aeran let out a resigned sigh and asked calmly. Tonks composed herself and looked at him seriously. "My mother misses the whole family," she said, maintaining her gaze on him. "I hope somehow they can reconcile, except for Bellatrix and Sirius, who are on the run and missing." Aeran raised an eyebrow upon hearing her request. "You do realize your mother was expelled from the family for not practicing the inherited technique, right?" Tonks fell silent. She understood the importance of the inherited technique for a noble house. Her mother refused to practice it and was expelled from the family. But can't they reconcile? Tonks asked, a glimmer of hope in her dark eyes. Of course they can, but you need to understand that your mother's decision hurt many people. She chose to voluntarily leave the family, Aeran replied, sighing with a slightly softer look. He realized Tonks wanted to help in the reconciliation, but this decision wasn't in her hands, it was up to Narcissa, Bellatrix, and Arcturus. Arcturus, in particular, never showed anger towards Andromeda for her decision, at least not that he spoke of. There was only a bitter and sorrowful feeling. Tonks opened her mouth to try to refute and defend her mother's actions, but she remained silent. In the end, she muttered resentfully, "Why is that damn technique so important? More important than family itself." Aeran stayed quiet. Obviously, he knew why the inherited technique was so important, but he chose not to explain it to Nymphadora. Even though she might have the blood of the House Black running in her veins, she was still an outsider, called Tonks. Observing Tonks in silence, Aeran decided to continue the conversation. "While I may not be able to do much, I can send a letter asking Narcissa to meet with Andromeda. However, whether she accepts the request or not is not under my control." Tonks's dark eyes almost seemed to light up for a moment as she hugged Aeran and exclaimed excitedly, "Thank you! Thank you! Thank you! Thank you! Thank you!" She continued repeating the same word, unaware of the look of disgust on the boy's face. Breaking free from her embrace, Aeran looked at her angrily and said coldly, "Don't touch me, I don't like strangers touching me." Tonks ignored his words and laughed cheerfully. While what he was doing might not have been particularly important to Aeran, it was different for her. It was a chance for her mother to improve, to get better, and to come out of a mild depression. Unmoved by her joy, Aeran coldly gave the eviction order. "Now go away, if they catch you in the common room, they'll want your head." Giving him a peck on the cheek, Tonks transformed back into Doria and left regardless of Aeran's face growing colder with her actions. With a cold huff, Aeran returned to reading his newspaper. For some reason, women around him seemed to enjoy provoking him above all else. Austria, Austrian Alps, Nuremberg. Over the decades, with the constant increase of acolytes, the castle originally built to serve as a prison for Grindelwald's enemies had become the main gathering point for them. Countless renovations had turned Nuremberg into a vast complex entrenched within the very bowels of the mountain it was located in. Seated at the round table, the Dark Lord known as Gellert Grindelwald observed his acolytes with a subtle smile. Rising from his chair, he addressed the assembly with a penetrating gaze. "My brothers and sisters, the promised day is near. The day when we shall finally purify our beautiful planet of these abominations." Almost fanatical expressions crossed the faces of most present. Decades of work were about to be successfully concluded, how could they not be in complete ecstasy? Grindelwald continued speaking. "When our glorious purpose is fulfilled, we shall be reborn into a world free from the risk of our children being cruelly killed by monsters. A pure world that we can truly call our own. A pure world of magic and brilliance." His voice, smooth and laden with emotion, echoed throughout the chamber. "Brothers and sisters, we do not act for glory, wealth, or power. We do not kill for pleasure, hatred, or fear. We do what we do for a better world, even if ignorant fools think otherwise." Gazing at the fervent crowd of acolytes, Grindelwald clenched his fist and continued. "But I do not blame them. This corrupt society has forced them to think this way. We are their salvation and their executioners to the end." The Dark Lord concluded. Grindelwald took a deep breath and uttered, "For the greater good. For the greater good. For the greater good. For the greater good." The acolytes echoed his words in unison. "My lord, are you sure we will cooperate with them?" Aurelius, always by Grindelwald's side, questioned, his expression showing disgust at the mention of them. Grindelwald didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting to the magnificent view through the window. Then, he turned back to Aurelius with a smile. "Our organization and those lunatics will attack Hogwarts together, Aurelius. We only need the ley lines of Hogwarts to complete the final stage of our plan and nothing more," he stated, gripping his adoptive son's shoulders with his silver-eyed gaze, reminiscent of the moon. "Our purpose in this world is more important than anything else," he spoke, releasing his shoulders. He turned his gaze back to the window and continued. "If they want the life of that child with special eyes, so be it. Are we going to help kill her?" Aurelius asked, confused. "Do you really think it's easy to kill a special grade wizard, Aurelius?" Grindelwald didn't answer and threw the question back. Almost all special grade wizards and witches are similar in strength, unless it's an extremely destructive inherited technique. I find it difficult for one special grade wizard to kill another, Aurelius responded without hesitation. That's right, if a special grade wizard is determined to flee, they will flee. Few can hold a special grade wizard for long, Grindelwald agreed with his adoptive son's words. So, if this group of lunatics attacks Hogwarts, isn't it the same as suicide? The place has 3 special grade wizards and 2 semi-special grade wizards. Aurelius became even more confused. Albus Dumbledore, Rose Potter, Asterion Black, Minerva McGonagall, and Phileas Flitwick. That's why they've allied with us, but we don't underestimate them, Aurelius. Madmen often have even crazier tricks up their sleeves. Grindelwald laughed and looked out at the snowy mountains through the window. I'm coming, Albus. You still owe me a battle to the death, Grindelwald murmured to himself with an excited smile, like a child who had finally gotten what they wanted from their parents. Chapter 54, Chapter 52, A Treacherous Game of Chess, 1. 3 weeks, that was the time he searched for the Chamber of Secrets, but the place was nowhere to be found in Hogwarts, as if it had completely vanished from the face of the earth. If it weren't for the Sorting Hat stating that the Chamber of Secrets existed, Asterion would have doubted its existence in this reality. Rhythmically tapping his fingers on the table, Asterion delved into deep thoughts. If the Chamber of Secrets wasn't in Hogwarts, there was only one place it could be, the Forbidden Forest. Even if I don't follow the canon, will I be dragged into it eventually? Asterion murmured to himself as he watched the orange flames of the fireplace. The comforting crackle of the flames seemed to bring him an inexplicable sense of calm. But, it won't be so simple to drag me into this mess, Asterion murmured with a cold smile, as he continued to contemplate the spectacle of the flames. It was a game involving Dumbledore, Voldemort, and himself, each with their distinct objectives. Dumbledore manipulated Hogwarts as if it were a chessboard, with the Philosopher's Stone as the prize for whoever could take down his queen, all with the purpose of luring Voldemort out of the hole he called a hideout. Even aware that it was a trap set for him, Voldemort chose to participate in the game in the hope of regaining his body. Whether Dumbledore or Voldemort, both trusted their own lives to win in this game of manipulation, lies, and power. But Asterion had no intention of becoming a mere pawn in the hands of 2 extremely powerful and experienced wizards. He knew he wouldn't stand a chance against Dumbledore and Voldemort when it came to manipulation. After all, at just 13 years old, he definitely didn't have the same experience or patience needed to manipulate everything and everyone like they did. But don't blame me for flipping the chessboard when I lose patience, Asterion said, resting his head on his hand and displaying a sarcastic and ironic smile. He was determined not to submit to the plays of Dumbledore and Voldemort, even if it meant challenging the rules of the game. Headmaster's office. Rose observed the office with great curiosity, but after a moment of analysis, she found nothing particularly interesting. It seemed just like a typical office of an elderly man, filled with portraits, common objects, and many books. Rose, thank you for coming. Dumbledore greeted her with a smile, but she only smiled back, not bothering to respond. She sat in the chair across from him and stared at him with her radiant blue eyes. Would you like something to drink, Rose? He offered, with a gentle smile and a warm look. No, thank you. I've learned not to accept sweets from strangers, especially from suspicious old men. Rose replied, her smile tinged with sarcasm. Well said. Dumbledore laughed, taking a sip of his honey tea. He ignored the provocative words of the 13-year-old. Then, he looked seriously at Rose and asked, what do you think of the wizarding world, Rose? From what I've seen, it's a rather backward, prejudiced, and quite authoritarian world, in my opinion. Rose responded, keeping her gaze fixed on Dumbledore. Dumbledore nodded, continuing. Part of this is due to magical secrecy, which prevents Muggles from knowing about the existence of magical beings. Both worlds haven't delved deep enough. England, in particular, is one of the most conservative countries in this aspect. Many of our laws haven't been altered in over 4 centuries, a time when the nobility held particularly powerful sway. The expression particularly powerful was a euphemism on Dumbledore's part. 400 years ago, Muggle-born wizards couldn't ascend in the magical society. Without money, many were forced to return to the Muggle world, unable to continue their studies or research. It was a time when blood determined everything. Blood meant power, wealth, and status. Without it, you were just a dirty, hungry peasant. My magical history teacher is Professor Binns, Rose commented with a bored tone. Dumbledore wasn't offended by her words. Stroking his long white beard, he looked at the girl with grandfatherly tenderness and let out a low chuckle. Patience is a virtue, Rose. There will be moments in your life when you'll need it. Rose rolled her eyes at his words. Patience was the last thing she had at that moment. All she wanted was to leave and, perhaps, tease Asterion a bit. She enjoyed trying to change that perpetually cold expression on his face. Noticing Rose's growing impatience, Dumbledore shook his head and continued. With my status as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, I granted some rights to Muggleborns and Half-Bloods, which threatened their status, angering the nobility. As you may have read in some books, unfortunately, this eventually led to war. A war because I granted 1% of the rights that belonged to the noble class to those who truly needed them. This enraged them so much that they embraced Voldemort as their leader, largely in part due to his connection with Salazar Slytherin. Combine an extremist and an equally extremist ideology, and the result is genocide against Muggles, Muggle-born wizards, and half-bloods, along with some pure-bloods. Rose's eyes grew particularly cold at the mention of Voldemort, her parents' killer. Why are you telling me this? She asked, sitting up straight in the padded seat. Rose, when I'm gone, the nobility will regain all the power they had before. Nearly 50 years of work will be thrown away. People need a leader, someone to protect their rights, Dumbledore explained bluntly. These words caused Rose's eyes to widen briefly, looking at Dumbledore as if she were seeing a madman. With the explanation she had received from Asterion on the Hogwarts Express, she could understand the nuances in Dumbledore's words. You want me to take your place in the Light faction? She asked, still somewhat incredulous. Exactly. I want you to take my place as the leader of the Light faction, Dumbledore confirmed with a nod. Rose didn't know what to say. She wasn't naive, she understood perfectly the implications of Dumbledore's words. However, if she were asked if she wanted that, the answer would be an emphatic no. Without Dumbledore needing to read her mind, he knew exactly what she was thinking. I know, Rose. You don't want this, but don't answer me now, my old bones can still hold out for a few more years. Dumbledore showed a smile and spoke, showing his arm with sagging skin, as if he wanted to reinforce his words. Rose didn't respond and left the office without saying anything to Dumbledore. Dumbledore watched Rose leave his office with a calm and serene look. He looked at his own hands aged by time and murmured to himself. Rose, you will learn that when the world needs you, it doesn't ask for your permission, it orders. Leaning weakly in his chair, Dumbledore looked at his old friend who had just arrived and murmured. For the greater good, Fox. The beautiful phoenix just chirped a lovely, comforting tune, bringing a smile to the lips of the Hogwarts headmaster. Walking through the corridors of Hogwarts, Rose ignored the admiring gazes of other students, lost in deep thoughts. Suddenly, she spotted Asterion carrying some books in his arms, likely from the Hogwarts library. Without hesitation, she approached, took his hand, and dragged him into a nearby broom cupboard, to the surprised looks of the first-year students and the ambiguous, provocative looks from the older ones. Help, I'm going to be abused, Asterion said sarcastically inside the broom closet, looking at Rose. Rolling her eyes at his words, Rose stared at him seriously. Little star, I want you to answer something, she said with an extremely serious tone, leaning against the wall. Asterion was surprised by the seriousness in her voice and nodded, agreeing with her words. If I become the leader of the Light faction, what will happen to me? Rose asked. Dumbledore offered you the position, Asterion understood the seriousness of Rose. Honestly, he was surprised. Dumbledore spoke to Rose. That truly surprised him. He thought the old manipulator wouldn't reveal the truth until a few years later. You don't seem surprised, said Rose, noticing his lack of reaction, her eyes slightly narrowed. It's obvious. Think carefully about your life and see that almost everything in it has Dumbledore's hands behind it, Asterion replied coldly, uncaring about Rose's feelings. This made Rose clench her fists tightly. She took a deep breath and calmed herself, feeling that if she continued to dwell on this, Hogwarts might cease to exist. To answer your question, I have to ask something first. Do you want me to answer as your cousin or your future enemy? Said Asterion, leaning against the door, looking at Rose with a cold gaze. Rose furrowed her brow and responded determinedly. Both. Very well, said Asterion. As your future enemy, I advise you not to accept his proposal. With your conviction to irritate me, it's possible that I might try to kill you at some point in your life. You're particularly irritating. His words made Rose's lips curl into a smile. Asterion continued speaking, this time with a cold and chilling tone. Prepare to be my enemy, I won't hesitate to make you bleed in the Wizengamot. I'll do whatever it takes to achieve my goals, including killing your supporters. Rose narrowed her eyes at Asterion, she didn't doubt his words. As your cousin, I advise you to accept. The political and personal power it will bring will make you one of the most important people in the world. You'll have the entire legacy of the most powerful man in the world, who was considered the second coming of Merlin. Whether it's knowledge, wealth, political power, or access to his entire organization, you'll have it all, Asterion finished. Rose remained silent, delving into her deepest thoughts. Did she want all that power? For what purpose? To change the world? To engage in political disputes in a magical parliament? Rose wasn't sure. She didn't feel rushed to answer. As Dumbledore had said, she had a few years to respond to Albus Dumbledore's proposal. Chapter 55, Chapter 53, A Treacherous Game of Chess, 2. On the following day, after the end of the defense against the dark arts class, the students left the room relieved. It seemed to be a class none of them enjoyed, partly because of the professor, partly due to the content itself. Quirinus wasn't exactly the most beloved professor at Hogwarts. That was a unanimous opinion among the students, from 1st to 7th year. MMR Black, please, stay a moment, Quirinus suddenly stuttered, surprising everyone. Without asking questions, the students exited the room. Before leaving, Daphne shot a look of confusion at Quirinus. She always felt that this professor wasn't as simple as he appeared. Sometimes, an especially sinister aura emanated from him. Any problem, Professor? Asked Asterion, his voice cold and indifferent, fixing his red eyes on the purple turban atop the man's head. Here we go, thought Asterion. He never thought of speaking amicably against Voldemort, he would have a showdown today with the Dark Lord who most terrorized the British wizarding community. When Rose had spoken to him the day before, Asterion had predicted that Voldemort would also make his move against him. Therefore, the Black Heir wasn't surprised by the current situation. It was expected. SMR Black. Before Quirinus could finish speaking, his face contorted in pain, turning pale and sickly. Asterion knew that Voldemort was assuming control of Professor Quirinus's body. It wasn't a pleasant process, but the major consequence was that Voldemort was draining Quirinus's vitality to fully manifest himself. Even if he wasn't killed by Harry Potter in the original world, Quirinus's fate wouldn't be much different. He would die by his master's hand. There was no other option for him. He was already a dead man, he just didn't know when he would die. Suddenly, Quirinus's body turned away from Asterion, and the turban on his head unraveled, revealing not just a bald head, but a terrifying face in place of the hair. A face full of sharp, pointed teeth, with bright crimson eyes shining like a menacing and eerie light. I believe this is the first time we've met, Heir Black, the head spoke, and for a moment, Asterion thought he heard a hiss like that of a snake. Asterion placed his hand over his chest and gracefully bowed, looking directly into the crimson eyes. Yes, what an honor. I see you're in great condition, parasite, Asterion replied sarcastically, displaying the most ironic smile he could muster. His red eyes gained a supernatural gleam. Voldemort's face contorted in anger for a moment but soon returned to normal. Sarcastic words won't save you in the end, Heir Black, Voldemort threatened with his cold, hissing voice. I really want to see how you plan to kill me, being, well, a parasite in this body, Asterion retorted, veiled contempt on his face. He truly wished to test the patience of this arrogant shard of soul. As if sensing the provocative intent in his words, Voldemort flashed a chilling smile and spoke coldly, you'll have to try harder to provoke my wrath. Oh, for someone who was afraid of a baby overthrowing his rule, you have a very loud tone, Great Dark Lord, Asterion shot back, his disdain almost overflowing from his gaze. Voldemort's face contorted briefly. He had to admit, the boy had a venomous tongue capable of irritating anyone. Ignoring his furious gaze, Asterion proceeded coldly, stop with empty words and say what you want. What do I want? Voldemort looked at Asterion and grinned maliciously. The correct question is, do you want the location of the Chamber of Secrets? Asterion remained indifferent to the tempting words of the man, or rather, the monster he was. He wouldn't let Voldemort read his emotions and use them against him. Unperturbed by his indifference, Voldemort continued, do you think I haven't noticed your cursed spirits checking every corner of Hogwarts? You want the Chamber of Secrets, Asterian Black. The inborn technique of Salazar Slytherin, a temptation for a wizard. The Dark Lord spoke, his voice full of temptation and infinite glory. Showing a cold smile, Asterian toyed with his wand in his hands and spoke, looking at Voldemort with an amused gaze. Interesting, you speak as if you don't have it. Does that mean you weren't worthy to inherit Salazar's legacy? Asterian wanted to irritate Voldemort with another word, hinting at his probable failure to receive Salazar Slytherin's inheritance by using the Horcruxes, but that would reveal that Asterian knew one of Voldemort's most important secrets, the Horcruxes. This was something Asterian couldn't allow. On the other hand, Voldemort had decided something at that moment: he would kill Asterian in the most painful way possible. He would dismember him, tear out his heart, and eat it while the boy was still alive. Asterian's failure to inherit Salazar Slytherin's inborn technique was an eternal wound in his soul, and he wouldn't allow anyone to speak of it. Feeling Voldemort's malicious gaze like a snake ready to strike its prey, Asterian smiled inwardly. Voldemort's reaction more than confirmed his words. The Dark Lord had failed to awaken Salazar Slytherin's inborn technique. This was great news for Asterian. At least the Chamber of Secrets wouldn't be empty when he found it. Looking at Voldemort in silence, Asterian had a clear advantage over the Dark Lord, and that was comforting. So, how do you intend to seduce me to your side? But I'll tell you now, it's better not to waste my time. Otherwise. Asterian didn't need to finish for Voldemort to understand the nuances in his words. A curtain of shadows unfolded behind him, and the gigantic eyes of Nidhogg stared at Voldemort. In Asterian's shadow, Baskerville opened its hundreds of red eyes, staring at Voldemort with an eager and sadistic gaze. Both cursed spirits were ready for a battle to the death. The Dark Lord showed a look of disgust towards the two special-grade cursed spirits. The Black family's inborn technique was truly irritating to any special-grade wizard. It was like fighting against an army of one man. Especially for Voldemort's current state, he could only use magic, as his inborn technique, the corruption of malevolent gods, couldn't be used without a physical body. Looking at the arrogant boy, Voldemort hissed and spoke coldly, "I want Rose Potter, you want the Chamber of Secrets." Asterian couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at that. He truly didn't know where Voldemort's confidence in dealing with Rose came from. Rose wasn't just any special-grade wizard, she was a monster among monsters. "You seem very confident in dealing with Rose," Asterian said coldly, trying to gather some information. "Stop trying to glean information from me, arrogant boy." Asterian simply shrugged and remained indifferent. He wasn't surprised to have been found out. Revealing a murderous intent, Asterian spoke, "Yes, you're right, I want the Chamber of Secrets, but why do you think I would work together with my father's killer? In the face of power, what are fathers?" Voldemort sneered coldly, his eyes not hiding the disgust and contempt he felt for his parents. "Well, my father was killed by you, your father on the other hand, thought he was ugly enough to go buy cigarettes and never come back," said Asterian, intensifying his bloodlust, speaking without caring if he would make Voldemort furious. He counted on it, killing a man driven by fury was much easier than killing him when calm. "Ha ha 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 ha." Voldemort laughed. He let out a loud, powerful, and chilling laughter. "I'm going to kill you," he said, looking at Asterian with a growing bloodlust, much greater than Asterian's own. Asterian showed no fear and raised his hand, pretending to tremble it as if he were afraid. "See, I'm shaking in my boots," he said sarcastically. As Asterian finished his sentence, a bolt of red energy shot towards him, the crackling sound reverberating through the classroom. Asterian, still holding his wand, didn't hesitate and retaliated with the same lightning spell, but his bolt was of a vibrant blue. The two bolts collided in the air, generating plasma that dispersed in all directions. Asterian intensified the output of magical energy, causing the blue bolt to gain the upper hand over the red bolt in the tug-of-war. Voldemort attempted the same, but he was merely a fragment of a soul parasitizing a body that wasn't his own. The more Voldemort used Quirinus's magic, the closer the man was to death. This weakened the Dark Lord's magic to the bare minimum. Realizing his advantage, Asterian didn't hesitate, continuing to cast smaller bolts while maintaining the main bolt. The blue bolt struck the walls, leaving charred trails and partially melting them. Asterian showed no mercy, he commanded Baskerville to attack alongside Nidhogg. With a sadistic laugh, Baskerville emerged beside Voldemort, using the Dark Lord's own shadow to move, and opened its huge mouth, filled with sharp teeth, ready to devour him with a single strike. Realizing the imminent danger, Voldemort used his other hand to cast a wandless and silent spell. Like an invisible magical blade, the spell sliced through the air and collided with the enormous demonic dog, and to the Dark Lord's surprise, the dog swallowed the spell as if it were a tasty snack. Baskerville, mocking Voldemort, laughed sadistically as it continued its attack, always aiming for the opponent's blind spots. Voldemort was forced to transform into a black mist and hover in the air to avoid the creature's relentless attacks from 100 eyes. Nidhogg, wreathed in lightning, quickly occupied a large part of the classroom and attacked from all sides with its powerful electric discharge. Asterion, protected by his armor, remained unscathed by the cursed spirit's red bolts, while Voldemort was assailed by bolts capable of melting steel. Asterion raised his wand, following Voldemort's movements, and waved it while chanting the spell, Lacarnam Infl Amari. An explosion of high-temperature flames blocked Voldemort's advance. To Asterion's surprise, Voldemort manipulated the flames to his advantage, creating an immense serpent of fire that collided with Nidhogg, spreading fire and lightning throughout the classroom, which was on the verge of ruin. If it weren't for Hogwarts' magical resilience, this part of the castle might have been destroyed long ago. Feeling the heat of the flames emanating from the fire serpent, Asterion began to float in the air, closely following Voldemort, using his flying cloak. He attacked alongside Baskerville, casting numerous attack spells and causing the two serpents to entwine with each other. If it weren't for holding back, Asterion would have allowed Nidhogg to unleash its full force, easily defeating the fire serpent. However, he didn't want to destroy Hogwarts and kill thousands of people in the process. The three flew around the classroom, causing it to shake. The chairs where the students sat had long been destroyed, turning to dust on the floor. Voldemort, realizing he had no more time and sensing the collapse of Quirinus's makeshift body, began to prepare to use his own inborn technique, using Quirinus's body as a vessel. This would likely result in Quirinus's death, but the Dark Lord cared little for a mere puppet. At the same time, Voldemort couldn't help but notice that his encounter with Asterion didn't go as planned. He wanted to manipulate the boy to be his pawn for a while, but from the outset, Asterion showed no interest in working with him. Bringing his hands together, one facing in the opposite direction of the other, Voldemort spoke coldly. Inborn spell manipulation, corruption of malevolent gods, universal decay. A decadent black glow bloomed around him, causing everything that came near to decompose into a pool of putrid liquid. At the same time, using reverse technique, Voldemort prevented the decomposition of the body he was parasitizing. Asterion, sensing the danger, didn't hesitate to use Baskerville as a shield and continued to move away from the reach of the attack, looking shocked at Voldemort. What had just happened reduced everything he understood about inborn technique to nothing. Even Baskerville's high magic resistance was not enough to fully block the inborn technique, melting a third of the demonic dog. Voldemort seized the chance as Asterion retreated and disappeared behind a pillar, likely one of the numerous secret passages. Asterion didn't prevent the escape and landed on the ground. The fire serpent fighting against Nidhogg lost its magic supply and dissipated into an explosion of flames. It wasn't all bad, I discovered a lot of important information, but... Looking at the ruined classroom. Dumbledore will surely want me to pay for this. Chapter 56, Chapter 54, A Treacherous Game of Chess, 3. As Asterion contemplated the situation at hand, he noticed the arrival of two individuals, followed by the arrival of a man in a blue robe. Minerva McGonagall, a witch of semi-special grade. Filius Flitwick, a wizard of semi-special grade. Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful man in the world. Seeing Dumbledore arrive last, Asterion internally scoffed. As heir to the House of Black, he had access to the barrier protecting Black Manor. One could say that within the mansion, Asterion could see and feel anything within the mansion's perimeters. Hogwarts was no different from Black Manor in this aspect. Dumbledore absolutely knew that a fight was happening in the classroom but chose to watch the show from the sidelines. Mr. Black, what in Merlin's name happened here? Professor McGonagall asked, shocked, looking at the destruction in the classroom. Showing a pensive look, Asterion decided it was time for a bit of politics. He needed to exert pressure on the school council, and this was a great opportunity for it. I should be asking that, Professor. Why, in Merlin's name, was I attacked by a teacher? He asked, causing Filius and Minerva to widen their eyes. Was it Professor Quirinus, Mr. Black? Professor Flitwick asked with a deep tone. Even his small stature couldn't hide the coercion of a wizard of semi-special grade. The wizard's reasoning was obvious, they were in the defense against the dark arts classroom. Looking at Dumbledore still in silence, Asterion nodded, confirming his words, and added, "Indeed, Professor. It was Quirinus Quirrell, he attacked me when I refused to participate in his conspiracy." "Conspiracy?" Both of them were surprised. "Yes, he wanted me to participate in an attack against Rose Potter," Aeran spoke, leaving the two professors even more surprised and equally confused. "Why would Professor Quirrell attack Lady Potter?" Phileas Flitwick, still incredulous, asked confusedly. His eyes widened in shock at the sudden information he was hearing. But Aeran's next words made the two professors feel like they had entered a frozen cave. A chill ran down their spines as a rare look of fear reflected in their eyes. "That's because it's not Quirinus, but Voldemort himself, parasitizing Professor Quirrell's body." That. Whether Phileas or Minerva, they didn't know what to say at this moment. They had so many doubts in their minds that they couldn't formulate a sentence at this moment. "That is certainly terrible news, Aeran," Dumbledore spoke, drawing everyone's attention. His blue eyes gazed at Aeran with a gentle and kind look. "Yes, terrible news for both of us," Aeran replied, his sarcastic tone noticeable to anyone. Although it was bad news for Dumbledore, it was news that impacted him primarily. Aeran was certain that if news of Voldemort's return spread, some idiots from the Pureblood faction would follow their old leader without hesitation. Never underestimate people's hatred and extremist ideology. But all of this was bad for Aeran. It meant civil war within the Pureblood faction. Something that Dumbledore would likely watch with pleasure, perhaps while eating popcorn. After all, it's a great feeling to see your old enemies killing each other without lifting a finger. The civil war, besides weakening the power of the Pureblood faction in the Wizengamot, would also further weaken the power of the noble houses. Aeran suddenly realized that perhaps the fight against Voldemort was just another conspiracy by Dumbledore against the Pureblood faction. This made the heir to the Black family grit his teeth in anger. The feeling of being manipulated like a puppet in someone else's show was truly unpleasant, leaving a lasting bitter taste in his mouth. Even though Aeran had managed to achieve his purpose, which was to pressure the school council to accept his emancipation, he had still been manipulated like a puppet by Dumbledore. Looking coldly at the harmless-looking elderly man, Aeran felt that his patience was wearing thin. He would try to kill the man sooner or later, preferably sooner. Pulling the Elder Wand from his robe, Albus Dumbledore spoke gently with a persuasive tone. "Mr. Black, I will take care of things from here on, but I ask that you keep today's events secret for now. We don't need fear spreading throughout Hogwarts." With that said, he aimed the wand at the ruined classroom, and with a graceful movement of his wand, the entire classroom seemed to rewind in time, and in a few moments, the whole environment was as it was before the fight between Aeran and Voldemort began. Aeran did not respond and looked at the simple wand in the man's hands, the Elder Wand. It appeared to be an apparently normal wand, lacking any opulence or beauty, but looks can be deceiving, and this time was no different. This wand was a legendary object in the wizarding world. One of the three Deathly Hallows. The cloak, the stone, and the wand. Rumors say that whoever possesses all three would have the power of death itself. The Elder Wand, to be wielded, had a single requirement to be fulfilled: defeat its current master. It didn't matter the method you used to defeat your opponent, as long as you did, you had the right to wield it until someone defeated you. A simple and harsh requirement. Unfortunately, this simple requirement was especially difficult in this era because the one wielding the Elder Wand was none other than the most powerful man in the world, and it was certainly no easy task to defeat Albus Dumbledore. Dumbledore certainly noticed his gaze on the wand and smiled amiably at Aeran, who returned the kind look with a cold and chilling gaze without saying another word. Aeran simply left the classroom with a slightly colder expression than usual. Since Dumbledore liked to play chess, Aeran would make the man bitterly regret playing chess with a teenager without patience. And he had a plan, a childish and rather simplistic one, but victories often came from simple plans. As he walked through the corridors of Hogwarts, Aeran remembered a phrase he had seen in his past life. "What sets kings apart from ordinary humans is their lack of fear. Just you wait." Aeran strengthened his heart's determination and went to find his lovely cousin, Rose Potter. He really wanted to see the faces of Dumbledore and Voldemort when things didn't go as they planned. Entering the Great Hall, Aeran walked over to the Gryffindor table and stopped behind Rose Potter, who was chatting with some girls she shared the dormitory with. "Rose, we need to talk," Aeran said, looking at Rose. Noticing the seriousness in his tone, Rose was surprised and nodded in agreement. She got up, bid farewell to her friends, and walked out of the Great Hall without caring about the thousands of eyes on them. At the Slytherin table, Pansy Parkinson looked at Daphne with malice and spoke sarcastically. This is the second time, it seems that the famous Ice Queen can't satisfy her man and he has to resort to other houses. You should be ashamed, heiress Greengrass. A mischievous smile played on the 13-year-old's lips as she ate an olive. The other girls also smiled, looking at Daphne. Daphne offended many people in Slytherin by preventing the girls from approaching Aeran. Everyone dared not say anything because of Aeran, but that didn't stop them from mocking Daphne at this moment. Daphne listened to everything and remained completely indifferent, but she gripped her fork slightly tighter, showing that she wasn't as calm as she appeared at that moment. She looked at each girl and noted their names one by one. She would seek revenge, and in a rather cruel manner. But for now, she had to stay strong. If she showed weakness at this moment, these girls would swarm around her like hungry hyenas looking for food. At the same time, she couldn't help but glance at the backs of Rose and her fiancé disappearing from the Great Hall. This did not please her at all. Aeran was very close to Rose, especially with the rumors that Rose dragged Aeran into a broom closet yesterday. Rumors about this had spread like mushrooms after rain. It affected her more than she expected, mostly because of her jealousy towards Rose, but it also significantly impacted her prestige in Slytherin. Everything was falling apart with the girls spreading rumors after rumors about her inability to keep their king away from girls from other houses. While eating with an indifferent expression, Daphne noticed that the food had no taste, it felt like candle wax. Nevertheless, she ate everything, maintaining a strong posture. Chapter 57, Chapter 55, A Treacherous Game of Chess, 4. In the astrology tower of Hogwarts, Aeran and Rose stared at each other in silence. Before we begin, I need to address something that may affect our collaboration, said Aeran, his black hair gently swaying in the wind. His red eyes met those of the white-haired teenager with indifference. Rose furrowed her brow and waited silently for his words. My father, Regulus Black, worked for the person who killed your parents. Aeran began, but before he could finish, a colossal magical energy engulfed him relentlessly, as if someone were trying to crush him like a cockroach. Aeran showed no weakness and released an equal amount of magical energy, colliding with Rose's pressure. With the collision of auras, the air became thin and heavy, gravity seemed especially intense around them, and the clouds in the sky dispersed instantly. Faced with Rose's angry expression, Aeran asked coldly, Are you going to listen to me, or are we going to fight here and now? Honestly, Rose's reaction was within Aeran's expectations, he even anticipated her attacking him. It was also a possibility for Hogwarts to be destroyed because of Rose's momentary anger, but it seems he underestimated Rose's emotional control. Rose clenched her fists furiously, but still gave Aeran a chance to explain. At this moment, she felt betrayed by this information, it caught her off guard. Seeing Rose calming down or at least holding back from punching him in the face, Aeran continued speaking. Before you jump down my throat, just know that my father regretted his actions and betrayed Voldemort. Before leaving the Death Eaters, he revealed the true origin of the man to the entire pureblood faction. After that, Voldemort found and killed him. Aeran's words alleviated the anger Rose was feeling at that moment, but she still looked at him with a particularly cold, almost distant, gaze. Even though it wasn't Aeran's fault, she still felt offended by his father's betrayal against her family. That's quite understandable, considering that if it weren't for Voldemort, Rose would have had a happy childhood, perhaps with brothers and sisters. Origin? Rose looked confusedly at him. What do you mean by Voldemort's origin? Exactly what I meant, Aeran replied. My father found out that Voldemort's name was Tom Marvolo Riddle, the son of Tom Riddle, a Muggle, and Mara P. Gaunt, a pureblood from the Gaunt family, which descended from the noble house of Slytherin. Regardless of Rose's surprised expression, Aeran continued speaking. Isn't it ironic, a man who always claimed to be pureblood is actually a half-blood? Believe me when I say that the pureblood faction didn't take kindly to the news. Unfortunately, interests come above personal feelings. Even though they didn't like the idea of a half-blood controlling them, the noble houses prioritized their interests over personal sentiments. Rose nodded and asked what else was confusing her at this moment. Why are you telling me this? Voldemort's back. Aeran simply dropped a piece of news that made Rose's eyes nearly explode with blinding light. Where and how did you learn this information? Rose asked, her tone cold and chilling, causing Aeran to look at her with a slightly surprised expression. He truly hadn't expected Rose to display such a look. I've just been attacked by him in the classroom. The proud Lord Voldemort was parasitizing Professor Quirrell, Asterion replied with a cold, sarcastic smile when he mentioned Voldemort's condition. Rose smiled, and a cold, murderous intent emanated from her. Seeing Rose ready to leave, Asterion said something that made her stop. Before you hunt him down, I have to tell you something. Rose looked confused at Asterion, as if asking, is there more? Don't you see, Rose? We're mere puppets in Dumbledore and Voldemort's games, Asterion said, his voice cold, carrying a hidden thirst for blood, disguised by his indifference. These old bastards manipulate us to achieve their own objectives, he continued, his black hair floating in the wind as his eyes fixed on the sun in the blue sky. Rose stopped and fell silent. She had already suspected this, she could subtly feel that Dumbledore was guiding her along a predetermined path, also that, in the end, she could take her place. And what do you suggest? She asked after a brief silence, her blue eyes calmly and coldly locking onto Asterion. Let's end this damn chess game and turn Voldemort's and Dumbledore's plans into rubbish, Asterion replied, leaning against a pillar as he watched her. Asterion lowered himself even more and ended up sitting on the ground. Rose sat beside him and looked at him with a gaze of apology and guilt. She hugged her own legs and spoke in a low tone. Sorry for almost fighting you because of your father's mistakes. Asterion, who was about to continue discussing the plan to end Dumbledore and Voldemort, looked at Rose with surprise. He shook his head and replied with an indifferent tone. When I decided to talk about my father's past, I already expected your reaction. It's normal to feel angry and to take out that anger on those close to the guilty party. Humanity always likes to blame the wrong people. That doesn't make me feel any better, Starlight. It makes me feel like garbage inside because I'm doing something I never thought I would. Rose spoke with a sad tone. You're strange, Snowflake. Instead of worrying about yourself, you're concerned about how I feel, Asterion replied, looking at her with indifference. That's because you're my cousin, I care about you. Rose elbowed Asterion's arm and spoke with a small smile on her lips, the sadness she was feeling dissipating a bit at that moment. Asterion looked deeply at Rose, opened his mouth as if to say something, but closed it the next moment before finally mustering the courage to speak. I reluctantly accept you as my cousin. Rose almost laughed at the funny expression he made when he said those words. To avoid angering Asterion, she suppressed her laughter and stood up. Call me when you're ready to start, she said as she turned and left the astronomy tower, leaving Asterion alone. Descending the stairs, Rose bit her lower lip hard and continued spiraling down the stairs while pondering the news she had just received. Especially the news about Asterion's father, she had almost unconsciously placed the blame for his father's mistakes on Asterion. That was foolish, she realized how silly she had been once the anger subsided. I hope I didn't hurt his feelings, Rose murmured to herself. But the other news made her eyes gleam with a cold look. When I find you, you'll wish you had stayed dead, Tom Riddle, she murmured as she descended the spiral staircase. Still in the tower, Asterion looked to where Rose had been sitting and muttered to himself. Things were simpler than I thought. I hope you enjoyed my gift, Dumbledore. Chapter 58, Chapter 56, Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 1. The Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Room shared many similarities with the Cursed Spirit Defense Classroom. Both were open spaces, however, the environment differed due to the presence of an immense ring drawn on the smooth marble floor. In charge of teaching this class was Professor Irene Dragnell, a tall woman in her 30s, with flaming red hair and piercing green eyes. Her beauty was marked by strong and sharp features like a knife, and her gaze denoted an unwavering intensity. She stood at around 190 centimeters tall and wore black leggings and a black sports bra for her medium-sized breasts while proudly displaying her beautiful abdominal muscles. The girls followed a similar style of attire to the professor, replacing the sports bra with a tight-fitting t-shirt. All the teenagers complemented the outfit with MMA gloves. The boys, on the other hand, wore similar ankle-length male leggings. For their upper bodies, they opted for long-sleeved shirts made of the same stretchy fabric as the leggings. Like the girls, they wore MMA gloves. Among the group of boys, Asterion stood out with his perfectly symmetrical and impressive abdominal muscles, an achievement he had dedicated years of effort to, even at just 13 years old. Theodora watched Asterion's muscles with envy and asked, Lord Asterion, could you tell me your training routine? All the other boys, including Draco, listened attentively. No matter who they were, all the boys wished to have muscles like Asterion's, most of them hoping to impress the girls with them. Another time I'll tell you, for now, focus on the class. Putting on the MMA glove, Asterion shook his head and replied. Suddenly, his gaze fell on the group of skinny boys in Gryffindor, though one boy in particular stood out with a swollen thumb in his group. He was tall for his age, surpassing Asterion. The teenager stood at around 184 centimeters tall, he had blue eyes and black hair. He possessed an enviable physique for any man with perfect muscles in every corner of his body, almost as if he was born for it fighting. Asterion recognized the boy. Neville Longbottom. It wasn't surprising that this was the only class he could enjoy without needing magical energy. Looking at Neville, Asterion showed a cold smile. He especially remembered the insult his grandmother made against him. Now was a good time to return the favor from 3 years ago. As Asterion plotted his malicious plan, the eyes of almost all the boys focused on the professor. Mainly fixated on certain parts of her body that were accentuated by the leggings and sports bra. Some even secretly fell in love with the teacher. After all, what teenager has never fallen in love with that beautiful teacher? In the girls' group, Tracy glanced at Asterion and swallowed hard, feeling a wave of heat that made her use her hand as a fan. It wasn't just her, all the girls were peeking at some particularly muscular boys. Although the Slytherin girls were only looking at the Slytherin boys. Considering their age and natural interests in boys, it wasn't surprising that they acted this way. I already love this class, Tracy murmured, displaying a mischievous smile on her lips. Noticing her friend's behavior, Daphne spoke coldly, "You can stop staring at my husband. Don't be selfish, Daph." "We're just looking," Tracy replied, indifferent to her friend's discomfort, and continued with a mischievous smile. She continued speaking, but with a touch of envy in her voice. "But honestly, I envy you, Daph. If it were me, I'd be touching those muscles all the time." Daphne snorted coldly but remained silent, though she glanced at Asterion while biting her lower lip. She didn't need to look around to know that all the Slytherin girls and girls from other houses were stealing glances at Asterion. Having a handsome husband was very dangerous in an environment full of girls with constantly flourishing hormones. Giving a resentful look at Asterion, Daphne focused on the class, seeing that the professor was about to speak. "Good afternoon, students," she spoke, her voice echoing for all regardless of distance. "I am Aeran Dragnell. As the name of this class indicates, you will be learning to fight with me," she said, looking at everyone with a calm and confident gaze. She ignored the not-so-discreetly excited looks from the boys falling over her body. It was no news to her that she was quite an attractive object for teenagers. For some reason, boys always seemed to be interested in older women. Although she thought it might partly be because of her mature body. Smiling somewhat coldly, she continued. "Unfortunately, today we will not be using reinforcement magic. I don't want to see any broken bones on this first day." Upon hearing about the possibility of breaking bones, most students showed a fearful look, remembering they would have the second Cursed Spirit Defense class next week. Some of you may be thinking that learning to fight is useless since you are wizards and can use magic, but you are completely wrong, Aeran spoke as she walked to the center of the ring. "I want you to understand that cursed spirits and dark wizards won't stand still waiting for you to hit them with your spells. They move swiftly and can kill you with the smallest of mistakes. Cursed spirits, in particular, have always engaged in physical fights due to their low intellect, and their bodies are hard, resilient, and regenerate quickly," she continued explaining, disregarding the students' feelings. Aeran looked at everyone and spoke with a smile. "So it's essential that you specialize in hand-to-hand combat, especially those who wish to become aurors. It's an important requirement to score at least an O in magical self-defense tactical training to qualify for the chance to participate in the Ministry of Magic's exams." With these words, most of those who dreamed of being an auror became extremely excited and serious, listening to every word of the professor as if they were hearing sacred words. Holding the box, she continued, "In my class, you will fight against each other. Your opponents will be randomly drawn, so line up and come draw your opponents." Slytherin, Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff lined up in 4 rows and drew one by one. First were the girls from each house, and none of the boys seemed to mind much, although they were excited to fight. "Tracy Davis from Slytherin vs Hermione Granger from Gryffindor," announced Aeran loudly, watching Tracy pull the paper containing the Gryffindor girl's name. In the Gryffindor girls group, Hermione suddenly felt nervous. She really didn't expect to be the first one to be drawn. "Kick that arrogant snake's butt, Hermione!" cheered Lavender Brown, one of the girls she shared the dormitory with. "I've never fought anyone," Hermione said with a worried expression. "Your opponent doesn't either, or I hope not." Rose comforted her friend with a smile, though she was worried about Hermione taking a beating. Slytherin students had many advantages over Muggle-borns, whether in knowledge, wealth, or training. Rose noticed this by observing the upright posture of almost all Slytherin students. She just hoped Hermione wouldn't take too much of a beating. Hermione, remember, keep your focus and pay attention to your surroundings, punch when necessary, and dodge when you think you'll get hit, she advised Hermione, looking at Tracy approaching in the center of the ring. Hermione nodded and took a deep breath, casting one last glance at her friends and receiving encouraging looks from all of them. Gathering courage, she walked toward the center of the ring with steady steps. In the center, the two teenagers stared at each other. It's a pleasure to finally meet the famous Hermione Granger. You're quite well known in Slytherin for keeping up with Daphne and Rose Potter in earning points, Tracy spoke amiably. As a half-blood, she didn't possess the pride of a pure-blood, something that certainly surprised Hermione. I didn't know I was that famous, Hermione replied, somewhat shy and surprised. She had expected the classic Slytherin arrogance. You're adorable. Seeing her expression, Tracy chuckled shrewdly. Observing the two girls speaking amicably, Aeran approached and spoke with a stern voice, girls, remember, this is a friendly competition, so no hits to the eyes, hair, or stomach. Whoever knocks down the other first wins. Yes, Professor. Both girls responded simultaneously. Aeran nodded satisfactorily and stepped back enough to arbitrate the fight. Instead of teaching the students how to fight first, she wanted to see each student's proficiency in combat before creating an individualized training regime. Thus, this first class was just for her to assess each student's abilities. Chapter 59, Chapter 57, Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 2. Hermione stood firm under her opponent's gaze, raising her guard with her arms and adopting a fighting stance. Although she had never fought anyone in her life, she still knew the basics. Tracy smiled and approached with her arms raised. As she got close enough to her opponent, she delivered a quick punch. The punch hit one of Hermione's arms, but Tracy had no intention of stopping. She kept punching, not giving the girl any space or time to breathe. Hermione felt the impact of the punches on her arms, but she remained steadfast, determined not to back down. Meanwhile, her mind was working frantically, trying to remember tips Rose had told her. Suddenly, realizing that Tracy was about to use her legs to unbalance her, Hermione noticed an opening, as the attacks had stopped. With agility, she dodged the leg aiming to knock her down and, seizing the moment, delivered a punch towards Tracy's face. Tracy, who was just playing with Hermione and underestimating her abilities, was shocked to see her dodge the kick and even more surprised to see the punch approaching her face. The expression of shock was plastered on her face as she tried to react in time. Unfortunately, it was too late to react. Bang! Hermione's punch landed on Tracy's cheek, causing the girl to recoil, holding her face while looking at Hermione in shock. Aeran couldn't help but show a look of appreciation for Hermione. It wasn't wrong not to know how to fight, but it was wrong not to be able to fight back. Although Hermione had no technique behind the punch, the girl had the will and patience to wait for an opportunity and strike back. That was a good punch, Granger. Wiping her cheek with the back of her hand, Tracy spoke, laughing. But I won't underestimate you again. Tracy assumed a serious and focused expression. She wouldn't underestimate Hermione a second time. She quickly approached and delivered a fast and precise punch. Bang! Hermione didn't even have time to react as the punch struck her on the chin, rattling her brain. She tried to stay balanced, but it was difficult when the world around her seemed to be moving. Tracy didn't stop there. She forcefully kicked Hermione's leg, causing the already dizzy girl to fall to the ground with a loud thud. On the ground, the curly-haired girl couldn't help but look up at the ceiling with a dazed expression. Although she knew her chances of winning were slim, she didn't think it would only last a few minutes after it started. Suddenly, a hand appeared in front of Hermione. She grabbed it and got up. That was a good fight, Granger. I hope you'll have improved by the next class. Tracy spoke amiably, her smile easing the feeling of loss within Hermione by a great deal. Next time, it won't be so easy to take me down, Tracy. Hermione looked at Tracy with a serious and determined look. I'm looking forward to it, Granger, Tracy replied, stepping back and returning to the group of Slytherin girls. Hermione returned to the Gryffindor girls group with a bit of embarrassment, but no one mocked her. They even encouraged her to try again in the next classes. Good job, Hermione, you managed to land a punch on her, Rose congratulated her friend with a smile as she put her arm around her neck. I still lost, Hermione replied, feeling a bit embarrassed to be praised despite losing. Rose shook her head and laughed. Don't worry about it, no one is born knowing how to fight. Hermione nodded and continued watching fight after fight of the girls, recording all the scenes and reviewing them using her innate technique which she called the Great Library of Alexandria. She promised herself that she wouldn't be so passive in the next fight. Daphne Greengrass from Slytherin vs Rose Potter from Gryffindor, Aeran announced after observing the note in Daphne's hands. Seeing Rose walk nonchalantly towards the center of the ring, Daphne shot a cold glance at the girl with white hair, aware that she was being underestimated. Before entering the ring, Daphne approached the group of Slytherin boys, to the surprise of many, including the professor. Facing Asterion, Daphne wrapped her slender arms around his neck and kissed him, causing shock to everyone around. Aeran couldn't help but feel that Daphne was deliberately flaunting her relationship for all the girls around, as if she were claiming who belonged to him. At the same time, Aeran felt an almost irresistible urge to punch Daphne. The scene before her was striking for someone single, like herself. After parting their lips, Daphne gave another kiss, but this time more chaste, and looked deeply into Asterion's eyes, as if expecting something. In the next moment, "Good luck in the fight, Daph," Asterion said with a gentler tone this time. Daphne felt energized in that moment upon hearing that, and proudly walked towards the center of the ring. "I must say, that was an interesting display, albeit somewhat childish," Rose commented, with her arms behind her head, her gaze falling upon the blonde with cold eyes tinged with annoyance. There was a smile on her lips capable of irritating even the blind. Asterion held a special place in Rose's heart, he had been the first relative she had known outside of the Dursleys. His sarcastic and straightforward personality was like a breath of fresh air amidst her disastrous family life. She had somewhat latched onto him during her time at Hogwarts. She couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort witnessing the display of affection between Asterion and Daphne, especially the gentle look he directed towards her. It was a look he had never offered her. Though reluctant to admit it, an uncomfortable sensation of jealousy began to take hold within her. "Jealous? If you want, I can ask him to kiss a napkin and give it to you, so you can indulge in your lonely nights, what do you think?" Daphne asked sarcastically, her eyes as cold as a snowstorm. Rose's smile almost faltered for a moment as the white-haired girl looked at Daphne with a slightly icy gaze. "I think I'll enjoy punching your face," she replied, clenching her fists with a smile on her lips. "It seems we have similar thoughts, Snowflake," Daphne retorted, assuming an attack position. Rose also took an attack position, she felt certain she would enjoy wiping the arrogant smirk off the blonde girl's face. Chapter 60, Chapter 58, Magical Self-Defense Tactical Training Class, 3, Chapter. Daphne struck first with a kick. Rose easily defended against the attack with her arms while delivering a punch towards her opponent. Daphne swiftly dodged, shifting slightly to the side. She then stepped back and looked at Rose with a dignified gaze. Fast. That was Daphne's initial thought about Rose's strikes. Her second thought was that there was no hesitation or fear in Rose's movements. If it weren't for the extraordinary perception she possessed because of the green grass house's inborn technique, heart of nature, it would have been difficult for her to evade the attacks of the girl with white hair. "Looks like someone's good at dodging," Rose taunted with a smile on her face. The green grass heiress coldly huffed and swiftly approached her, delivering quick and precise punches. Completely relaxed and unconcerned, Rose, with her hands behind her back, easily dodged the attacks with an extremely provocative smile. She circled around Daphne and leaned back as she whispered. "I'm going to show off a bit for your boyfriend, hope you don't mind." Daphne's eyes nearly instantly began to gleam with a cold light, a green aura spreading around her like an ethereal flame burning silently. The smell of ozone filled the classroom, and flashes flickered around Daphne. The thunderous sounds of thunder echoed. The green grass house's inborn technique, heart of nature, involved controlling natural phenomena, such as natural disasters, at the highest levels of mastery of the inborn technique. Daphne manipulated the lightning bolts as if wielding a weapon, aiming them at Rose, who still smiled nonchalantly. Without hesitation, she fired. Clearly, Rose easily dodged the attack and continued to evade the dozens of lightning bolts fired at her sequentially. Rose could have used the Limitless to become invincible, but she chose to dodge all the attacks to further irritate the Slytherin blonde. "Princess, you need to aim properly, otherwise you won't hit me." Rose pointed to the center of her own forehead and taunted while dodging a lightning bolt that nearly grazed her right cheek. Daphne stopped shooting lightning and focused on the atmosphere around Rose, making the air thin and heavy until she essentially created a vacuum in the space around her, wanting to see what Rose would do without air. Rose noticed the change in the atmosphere almost instantly. She didn't intend to let Daphne do as she pleased and reached out, then clenched her hand tightly. The space around Daphne suddenly contracted, locking the Slytherin blonde in place. Daphne tried to break free from the spatial prison, but she couldn't move. It was as if there was a barrier around her skin, preventing her from moving a muscle to free herself. The vacuum zone she wanted to create dissipated without her support, causing the air around Rose to return to normal. That was risky, princess. Well, risky is a strong word, but let's just say it was amusing. Rose walked up to Daphne and spoke provocatively. Their faces were dangerously close. Daphne's eyes practically gleamed with fury. In her life, she had never been so angry as she was at this moment. The most frustrating part was that she couldn't punch that smiling face of the white-haired witch. Irina approached and praised aloud, "A great fight, you both have excellent reflexes and speed, but I recall saying it was a friendly match." She looked at both girls and spoke sternly, "You two are disqualified. You both lost." Rose didn't care, anyone could see that she was the one who won. She didn't need someone to tell her whether she had won or lost. Giving Daphne a provocative kiss on the cheek, Rose laughed at the furious look on the girl's face and returned to the Gryffindor girls group, humming a pleasant tune. "I'm going to kill that witch." Daphne, free from the spatial confinement, spat out each word through clenched teeth. "Good luck with that," Irene said, noticing the tension between the two, likely an adolescent love triangle that she was too lazy to inquire about. Daphne turned and went back to the Slytherin girls group. No one dared to speak, noticing the cold and murderous aura she emanated. However, her power certainly surprised everyone, solidifying her status as one of the strongest in Slytherin, so the loss to Rose was not without gains. The girls' fights continued, nothing as shocking as Daphne and Rose's fight, but still very good fights, especially Luna Lovegood's, who defeated her opponent simply by dodging with erratic and unpredictable movements. Doria Malfoy's fight was also interesting, but she ended up being disqualified for using her inborn technique, Wheel of Fortune, to make her opponent stumble at every step, bringing misfortune to the Hufflepuff girl. A truly intriguing inborn technique. When all the girls finished fighting, the boys finally began. Theodora was the first, fighting none other than Ron Weasley. Well, calling it a fight was an understatement. Ron seemed to only have talent for wizard's chess, as he couldn't land a single blow on Theodora Knott, who constantly mocked him. In the end, Ron lost in a particularly embarrassing manner. Although this fight didn't garner much excitement from the bored audience, everyone became excited for the next match. Asterian Black vs. Neville Longbottom. How in the name of Merlin did that squib get into Hogwarts as a student? Shouldn't it have replaced Finch? Theodoro asked his shocked companion. At least in England, Neville was famous for almost wiping out the main branch of the Longbottom house. If Neville's son didn't possess magical abilities, the main branch would be officially declared extinct, and the side branch would take over the Longbottom house. It could be said that all purebloods knew Neville, not in a very good way. His grandmother must have spread her legs for Dumbledore, Draco sarcastically remarked, eliciting laughter from everyone. Asterion looked at the indifferent Neville. He could hide his emotions well, but the black air could sense the negative emotions ready to explode at any moment. As for the match with Neville, it was obviously rigged. Asterion used tiny cursed spirits he used for spying to hold onto the slip of paper containing Neville's name inside the box. Then he waited for his turn and picked the paper. "Everyone to the ring," Irene said, feeling a bit impatient with the incessant murmurs around. Asterion walked to the center of the arena with calm steps while checking to ensure his gloves were firmly secured on his hands. Neville also walked to the center of the ring with a particularly cold look, hiding a faint murderous intent behind his seemingly indifferent gaze. "It's been 3 years, Mr. Longbottom," Asterion greeted him, flexing his fingers, opening and closing them repeatedly. Neville didn't speak and continued to stare at Asterion with a cold gaze. "You know, I can feel your hatred towards me, but I'm confused," Asterion said, unconcerned by his silence. "I haven't done anything to deserve your hatred, yet you want to kill me," he spoke calmly. "Although I believe your hatred is against my family, I sense that you particularly want to kill me." Neville's eyes grew colder with each word from Asterion. His muscles tensed and became firmer, the teenager was ready to fight him. "So, I've realized. You hate me because I represent everything you're not. It hurts to look at me and see your opposite reflection, Aeran continued speaking, unfazed by Neville's subtle movements. When Aeran finished speaking, Neville rushed towards him. His speed seemed like a fleeting shadow to the other students, even to Irene, who widened her eyes in shock. Neville reached Aeran in 0.1 second. He clenched his fist and punched with all the force he could muster. Aeran didn't move a muscle to dodge. How rude to attack someone unprepared, Aeran spoke, looking at the fist that missed, passing beside his shoulder. Neville seemed shocked. He knew he couldn't miss, especially with the superhuman reflexes he possessed. But seeing that he had missed, Neville attacked again, but the same thing happened, and he missed the blow once again. The teenager didn't stop and continued to rain down punches on Aeran, but without exception, they all missed, and Aeran hadn't even moved a muscle to dodge. In the Gryffindor girls group, Hermione opened her mouth, witnessing the incredible scene. Punches that they couldn't even see the trajectory of, seemed to deliberately miss Aeran, who was still standing in the same place without dodging once. What's going on? She murmured to herself, still confused. Rose beside her glanced at Aeran's wrist, where a small silver snake was biting its own tail. She didn't need to be a genius to know it was a cursed spirit. Aeran, who was looking curiously at the punches, calculated the force behind each punch from the wind they caused. About 5 tons or less. He wasn't a physicist to calculate something like that accurately. But it was an incredible strength for a human body with not a drop of magical energy. Neville wasn't and couldn't use reinforcement magic to strengthen his body, so this was the pure strength of his body. An amazing achievement, but this wasn't the universe of One Punch Man, where Saitama could defeat everything with one punch. In most anime and similar universes, physical strength always took second place, losing only to the energy of the universe itself. In this world, it was no different. No matter how much strength you had, in the face of an energy capable of changing reality itself, human flesh was nothing. For example, Aeran stood still while using Ouroboros to manipulate fate, changing the fate of each of Neville's punches, causing him to miss each one. Certainly, Aeran himself admitted that using Ouroboros to manipulate the fate of mere punches, was at the very least, futile. But, he was childish on some occasions, so he opted to use a special grade cursed spirit intended to be used against a monster named Rose Potter.
Thanks for listening.